Hi friends. If you're enjoying my videos, please hit the like button. It helps the YouTube algorithm notice me. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I shouldered my heavy backpack, adjusting the straps one final time before setting off into the rugged wilderness of the Apuan Alps. It was September 15th, 2016, and I'd been planning this solo hiking trip through Italy for months. At 32 years old, I considered myself an experienced outdoorsman, but something about the looming peaks ahead sent a shiver of apprehension down my spine. I glanced at my watch. 7:30 a.m. Perfect timing to start the trek up to Monte Ferrato, the famous natural stone arch that promised breathtaking views of the coastline and surrounding mountains. The weather forecast predicted clear skies and mild temperatures, ideal conditions for a challenging day hike. As I left the nearly empty parking lot behind, I couldn't shake a faint sense of unease. The forest seemed to loom before me, ancient trees stretching their gnarled branches towards a pale sky. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to pre-hike jitters and the inherent eeriness of being alone in unfamiliar territory. Get it together, I muttered to myself, adjusting my backpack. It's just a hike. The first hour passed uneventfully as I made my way along the well-marked trail. Towering beech trees created a vibrant canopy overhead, their leaves just beginning to hint at the autumn colors to come. The air was thick with the earthy scent of decaying leaves and rich soil. Occasionally, I'd startle a bird or catch a glimpse of a small mammal darting through the underbrush. As I climbed higher, the forest began to thin, giving way to rocky outcroppings and stunted, wind-twisted trees. The trail became steeper and more challenging, requiring careful footing on loose scree and exposed roots. I paused frequently to catch my breath and take in the increasingly dramatic views. It was during one of these rest breaks, about halfway up the mountain, that I first encountered them. An older couple, probably in their mid-50s, descending the trail towards me. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have given them a second thought, just a pair of fellow hikers enjoying the beautiful day. But something about their demeanor immediately set me on edge. The woman seemed tense, her eyes darting nervously between her companion and the trail ahead. But it was the man who truly caught my attention. His face was ashen, a sheen of sweat visible on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. As they drew closer, I could see that he was visibly trembling, his steps unsteady on the rocky path. I tried to shake off my growing sense of unease, plastering what I hoped was a friendly smile on my face as our paths converged. "Buongiorno," I called out, using one of the few Italian phrases I knew with any confidence. The woman returned my greeting with a tight smile, but the man's reaction chilled me to the core. He stopped abruptly, his wide eyes locked on my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Before I could react, he reached out and gripped my shoulder, his hand shaking violently. "Sei tu," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Non può essere." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Though I didn't understand the words, the raw emotion in his voice was unmistakable, a mixture of shock, fear, and something that sounded unsettlingly like grief. "You okay, mate?" I managed to stammer out in broken Italian, fighting the urge to wrench myself away from his grip. The man continued to stare at me, mumbling words I couldn't comprehend. His eyes seemed to look through me, as if seeing something, or someone, else entirely. The woman gently pried his hand from my shoulder, wrapping her arm around him protectively. "I'm so sorry," she said in halting English, her voice strained. "You look like someone he once knew. Someone who—" She trailed off, shaking her head. Without another word, she began to guide her husband down the trail, leaving me standing there in stunned silence. I watched them go, a cold knot of dread forming in the pit of my stomach. As they disappeared around a bend in the trail, I could have sworn I heard a choked sob carried on the wind. Shaken, I forced myself to continue up the mountain, but the encounter had cast a pall over what should have been an exhilarating hike. Who had the man mistaken me for? What tragic history lay behind his reaction? The questions swirled in my mind, accompanied by an increasing sense that I had stumbled into something I didn't understand, and perhaps didn't want to. As I neared the summit, the famous stone arch of Monteferrato came into view. Under different circumstances, I would have been awestruck by the natural wonder and the sweeping vistas beyond. But now, standing alone on the windswept peak, I felt exposed and vulnerable. The vastness of the landscape only served to emphasize my isolation. I snapped a few perfunctory photos and quickly began my descent, eager to put the unsettling encounter behind me. But as I retraced my steps down the mountain, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I threw my backpack in the trunk and climbed behind the wheel, hands shaking slightly as I turned the key in the ignition. As I pulled out onto the winding mountain road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the trailhead, a pale, gaunt man staring after me with haunted eyes. I blinked, and the apparition was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had ever been there at all. The following morning dawned gray and overcast, a fitting mirror to my unsettled mood. I had spent a restless night at a small pensione in the nearby village, my sleep plagued by fragmented nightmares of pursuit through dark forests and endless mountain tunnels. The rational part of my mind insisted that I was overreacting to a simple case of mistaken identity, but I couldn't shake the visceral dread that had taken root in my gut. Over a meager breakfast of strong coffee and dry toast, I pored over my hiking maps, searching for a suitable route for the day. My original plan had been to tackle another well-known trail, but after yesterday's encounter, I found myself drawn to a more isolated area. My eyes kept returning to a remote section of the map, where a faint blue line indicated a stream winding its way through a largely unmarked expanse of wilderness. It was reckless, I knew. Veering off established trails in unfamiliar territory was a recipe for disaster. But some perverse impulse drove me forward, a need to prove to myself that I could shake off the lingering unease from the previous day. By 8 a.m., I was back on the road, driving deeper into the mountains. The pavement soon gave way to a rutted dirt track, my rental car bouncing and scraping its undercarriage as I pushed further into the backcountry. When the track finally petered out entirely, I parked in a small clearing and shouldered my pack. The forest here was different from the previous day's hike. Darker, more primeval. Ancient trees crowded close, their gnarled branches stretching overhead to block out much of the weak autumn sunlight. The underbrush was thick and tangled, making progress slow and difficult. I oriented myself using my compass and topographic map, aiming for the stream I had identified earlier. It would be my lifeline, I reasoned, a natural path to follow back to civilization if I became disoriented in the trackless wilderness. For the first hour, I maintained a steady pace, pushing through the dense vegetation and scrambling over moss-covered boulders. But as the day wore on, a creeping sense of wrongness began to overtake me. The forest was unnaturally quiet, devoid of the bird calls and rustling small animals I would have expected. The air felt thick and oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. By early afternoon, I knew with sickening certainty that I was lost. The stream I had been following had narrowed to a mere trickle, snaking its way between jagged rocks before disappearing entirely into a yawning sinkhole. I backtracked, trying to find where I had gone wrong, but the unfamiliar terrain seemed to shift and change with every step. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind as I realized the gravity of my situation. I was alone in a vast wilderness, off any marked trail, with limited supplies. The overcast sky made it difficult to gauge the passage of time, but I knew daylight would be fading soon. The thought of being trapped in these woods after dark sent a shudder of primal fear through my body. Forcing myself to remain calm, I decided to seek higher ground. If I could get above the tree line, I reasoned, I might be able to spot a landmark or get my bearings. I began to climb, my progress hampered by the steepening terrain and my own growing exhaustion. Just as I was about to give up hope, I crested a small ridge and saw it, a dilapidated structure nestled among the twisted trees. Relief flooded through me at this sign of human habitation, no matter how abandoned it appeared. As I drew closer, I saw that it was an old shepherd's hut, its roof of red tiles long since caved in. The stone walls still stood, however, creating a hollow shell with a single broken window serving as a doorway. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and a potential source of information about my location. I approached cautiously, years of horror movies and campfire tales making me wary of abandoned buildings in the wilderness. The hut's entrance gaped like a toothless maw, shadows pooling in its interior. I called out a hesitant greeting, more to reassure myself than out of any real expectation of a response. Silence was my only answer. Steeling my nerves, I ducked through the broken window, wincing at the crunch of fallen roof tiles beneath my feet. The interior was spartanly furnished, a rusted bed frame, the remains of a crude table, and not much else. Graffiti covered one wall, faded initials, and crude drawings left by generations of adventurous hikers or mischievous local teens. I shrugged off my backpack, grateful for the chance to rest and reorient myself. Pulling out my map, I spread it across a relatively stable section of wall, squinting in the dim light as I tried to pinpoint my location. 10 minutes passed as I pored over the creased paper, growing increasingly frustrated with my inability to match any landmarks to my surroundings. I was so engrossed in my task that at first I didn't register the sound. A soft scraping, like something moving over the broken tiles that littered the hut's floor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I strained to listen. For several long seconds, there was only silence. Then, unmistakably, I heard it again. The distinct sound of footsteps crunching over fallen debris. My heart hammering in my chest, I slowly turned towards the source of the noise. The shadows in the far corner of the hut seemed to deepen and writhe, taking on an almost solid form. As I watched, paralyzed with terror, a figure began to emerge from the darkness. It moved with an unnatural, jerky gait, as if its limbs weren't quite connected properly. I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of wickedly curved horns, of eyes that glowed with an unholy light in the gloom. A scream built in my throat, but before it could escape, rationality reasserted itself. I blinked, and the monstrous apparition resolved itself into its true form, a mountain goat picking its way delicately through the rubble-strewn interior of the hut. Relief washed over me, so intense it left me lightheaded. I let out a choked laugh, the sound harsh and foreign in the oppressive silence of the ruined building. The goat, startled by my outburst, bolted for the exit. Curious despite my lingering fear, I followed it outside, rounding the corner of the hut, just in time to see the animal bounding up the steep slope of a V-shaped valley I hadn't noticed before. The goat moved with incredible speed and agility, its muscular form blurring as it ascended the near vertical incline. For a moment, just a moment, the steep angle and fading light played tricks on my overwhelmed senses. The goat seemed to elongate, to rise up on its hind legs, transforming into a horrifyingly human-like figure sprinting up the mountainside. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling as it tried to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be possible. In that instant, I understood how legends of fauns and satyrs might have been born, the product of exhausted, frightened minds confronted with the harsh realities of an unforgiving wilderness. As quickly as it had appeared, the illusion shattered. The goat disappeared over the ridge, leaving me alone once more in the gathering twilight. But the seed of doubt had been planted, a creeping unease that whispered of other, darker possibilities lurking in the shadowed valleys of these ancient mountains. With trembling hands, I gathered my belongings and prepared to leave the shepherd's hut behind. But as I turned to go, something caught my eye. A flash of white against the weathered stone of the hut's interior wall. Hesitantly, I leaned in for a closer look. There, partially obscured by years of graffiti and grime, was a crude drawing. A stick figure with exaggerated horns and cloven hooves, rendered in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. And below it, a single word scratched into the stone with desperate intensity. Scappa. I didn't need to speak Italian to understand the message. My blood ran cold as the import of that single word sank in. Run. The fading daylight spurred me into action, overriding the paralyzing fear that threatened to root me to the spot. I stumbled away from the shepherd's hut, my mind reeling as it tried to process everything I had seen and experienced. The rational part of me insisted that there were logical explanations for it all, tricks of light and shadow, the product of an imagination overwrought by isolation and fear. But a deeper, more primal part of my psyche screamed that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong in these mountains. I consulted my map and compass with shaking hands, determined to find my way back to some semblance of civilization before full dark descended. But the deepening gloom and my own panicked state made navigation nearly impossible. Every tree looked the same, every rocky outcropping a potential landmark that dissolved into meaningless shapes as I drew closer. The temperature dropped rapidly as night fell, and an insidious mist began to creep through the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and clammy, obscuring what little I could see of my surroundings. The silence that had seemed oppressive earlier in the day now felt charged with malevolent energy, as if unseen watchers lurked just beyond the range of my vision. I pushed on, driven by blind terror and the desperate hope that I would stumble across a trail or road. My flashlight carved a pitiful tunnel of illumination through the fog, the beam seeming to terminate abruptly as if absorbed by the unnatural darkness. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent jolts of adrenaline coursing through my system. Time lost all meaning as I stumbled through the wilderness. Minutes stretched into hours, each step a battle against exhaustion and the growing certainty that I was hopelessly, irretrievably lost. My water supply dwindled dangerously low, and the energy bars I had packed seemed a pitiful defense against the gnawing emptiness in my stomach. Just when I was on the verge of collapse, resigned to spending a night exposed to the elements and whatever horrors my mind conjured in the darkness, I heard it. The faint but unmistakable sound of running water. Hope surged through me, giving new strength to my leaden limbs. I veered towards the sound, pushing through dense underbrush with reckless abandon. The noise grew louder, resolving into the rush of a substantial stream or small river. I burst through a final stand of trees and found myself on the banks of a swiftly flowing watercourse. In the weak beam of my flashlight, I could see that it cut a deep channel through the forest, its waters dark and forbidding in the gloom. For a moment, I simply stood there, gulping in great lungfuls of the damp night air. Then, reason reasserted itself. Water meant civilization. If I followed this stream downhill, it would eventually lead me to inhabited areas. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all I had. I began to pick my way along the stream bank, my progress slow and treacherous in the darkness. The ground was slick with mud and rotting vegetation, and more than once I nearly lost my footing on the steep, uneven terrain. The stream itself was a black ribbon in the night, its waters moving with unsettling speed and purpose. As I stumbled forward, the banks began to rise on either side, the stream cutting deeper into the earth. Soon, I found myself in a narrow ravine, sheer rock faces looming over me. The air grew colder, damper, carrying with it the musty scent of decay and something else, an acrid animal smell that set my nerves on edge. My flashlight beam, already weak from hours of continuous use, began to flicker ominously. I fumbled in my pack for spare batteries, my frozen fingers clumsy and uncooperative. Just as I managed to extract the fresh batteries, a sound echoed through the ravine that turned my blood to ice. A low, rumbling growl, unmistakably predatory and far too close for comfort. I froze, the batteries slipping from my nerveless fingers and clattering on the rocky ground. The sound came again, louder this time, reverberating off the stone walls that hemmed me in. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A wolf? But some instinct told me this was something else entirely, something that had no place in the rational world I thought I knew. Panic overwhelmed me. I abandoned all pretense of caution and began to run, stumbling and sliding on the treacherous terrain. My failing flashlight cast wild, dancing shadows that seemed to take on monstrous forms in my peripheral vision. The growling intensified, punctuated now by the sound of heavy footfalls pursuing me through the darkness. I ran blindly, my lungs burning, driven by pure animal terror. The ravine twisted and turned, the stream beside me growing louder and more turbulent. Ahead I could see the rock walls closing in, the passage narrowing to a tight squeeze barely wide enough for a person to pass through. With no other choice, I plunged into the gap, forcing my body through the narrow opening. Jagged stone tore at my clothes and skin, but I pushed on, driven by the certainty that to stop would mean death. Behind me, I heard a furious roar of frustration, as if my pursuer had been thwarted by the narrow passage. I emerged on the other side, gasping for breath, only to find myself facing a new horror. The ravine ended abruptly in a sheer drop, the stream plunging over the edge in a thunderous waterfall. I skidded to a stop at the precipice, vertigo washing over me as I peered into the misty abyss below. Trapped between the unseen predator behind me and the deadly drop before me, I felt a moment of perfect crystalline terror. Then, from the darkness beyond the waterfall, I saw something that defied explanation. A pair of glowing, intelligent eyes, far larger than any natural animal's, regarding me with malevolent curiosity. In that moment of shock and disbelief, my foot slipped on the wet rock. I felt myself falling, tumbling over the edge of the waterfall into the unknown depths below. The last thing I remember is the rush of wind and water, and those terrible eyes watching my descent. I awoke to pain and darkness. For several long moments I lay still, struggling to piece together fragmented memories and make sense of my surroundings. Gradually, awareness returned. I was lying on hard, damp stone, the sound of rushing water echoing around me. The air was cold and thick with moisture, carrying that same musty scent of decay I had noticed in the ravine. Gingerly, I tested my limbs, relieved to find that nothing seemed to be broken despite my fall. My entire body ached, and I could feel the sting of numerous cuts and bruises, but I was alive. A minor miracle given the circumstances. I fumbled for my flashlight, praying that it had somehow survived the fall. To my amazement, it flickered to life when I pressed the switch, albeit with a weak, unreliable beam. In its feeble light, I began to take stock of my situation. I found myself in a vast cavern, its full extent lost in the darkness beyond my light's reach. The waterfall thundered nearby, feeding an underground river that disappeared into the gloom. The air was heavy with mist, giving everything a dreamlike, unreal quality. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. The cavern floor was littered with bones, some obviously animal, but others disturbingly human-like in appearance. Many showed signs of having been gnawed upon by powerful jaws. I scrambled to my feet, fighting down a wave of nausea. Whatever had been pursuing me above ground, whatever nightmarish creature those eyes had belonged to, clearly made its lair in these subterranean depths. Desperation lent me strength. I had to find a way out before the cavern's inhabitant returned. I began to search the perimeter, my feeble light probing the darkness for any sign of an exit. The cavern walls were slick with moisture and riddled with smaller tunnels and crevices, any one of which might lead to salvation, or deeper into this underground nightmare. As I moved along the cavern wall, My foot struck something that skittered across the stone floor. I aimed my flashlight down and felt my heart nearly stop. A human skull grinned up at me, its empty eye sockets seeming to mock my predicament. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. In my haste to get away from the grisly discovery, I failed to notice the drop-off behind me. My foot met empty air, and I felt myself falling once again. I tumbled down a steep, slippery slope, my world reduced to a confused blur of pain and vertigo. When I finally came to a stop, I found myself in a smaller chamber, this one mercifully free of bones. But as I regained my bearings, I realized I now faced an even more terrifying prospect. My flashlight, damaged by the fall, flickered one last time and went dark. I was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The kind of darkness that has weight and presence, that presses against your eyeballs and fills your lungs with each breath. I had never known such complete absence of light could exist. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, threatening to overwhelm me. I forced myself to remain still, to control my breathing, to focus on my other senses. Gradually, I became aware of sounds, the distant rush of water, the drip of moisture from unseen stalactites, and something else. A faint scratching, as of claws on stone, growing steadily closer. I held my breath, straining to pinpoint the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, echoing off the unseen walls of my pitch-black prison. Then, abruptly, it stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence and the pounding of my own heart. Then, a hot, fetid breath washed over my face. Whatever had been stalking me in the forest above had found me at last. I screamed then, a primal sound of terror that reverberated through the darkness. I scrambled backward, my hands scrabbling against slick stone, desperate to put distance between myself and the unseen horror that lurked in the blackness. My fingers found a narrow crevice in the rock wall. Without thinking, I squeezed myself into the gap, ignoring the pain as sharp edges tore at my skin. I pushed deeper into the fissure, driven by blind panic, until I found myself wedged tight, unable to move forward or back. There I remained, trembling and gasping for breath, as something large and powerful snuffled and clawed at the entrance to my sanctuary. I could hear the scrape of massive claws on stone, feel the vibration of a low, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the very mountain around me. How long I remained there, trapped in that lightless hell, I cannot say. Time lost all meaning in the suffocating darkness. Eventually, the sounds of my pursuer faded, but I dared not move, convinced that the slightest sound would bring the creature back. In that timeless void, my mind began to fracture. I hallucinated vividly. Flashes of light, ghostly faces peering at me from the darkness, whispering voices in languages I didn't understand. I relived memories of my life above ground, of sunlight and fresh air, convinced that I would never experience them again. Just when I had given up all hope, resigned myself to death in this lightless tomb, I felt something change. A faint current of fresh air, barely perceptible, brushed against my face. With agonizing slowness, I began to work my way towards its source. Inch by painful inch, I squeezed through the narrow fissure, my clothes torn to shreds, my skin raw and bleeding. The promise of that elusive breeze drove me onward, even as my strength waned and despair threatened to overwhelm me. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it, the faintest glimmer of light ahead. With a final, desperate surge of energy, I pushed through a last narrow gap and found myself blinking in the gray light of dawn. I had emerged on a steep mountainside, the rising sun just beginning to paint the sky with streaks of pink and gold. The beauty of it brought tears to my eyes after so long in darkness. But as I turned to look back at the crevice from which I had emerged, I saw something that chilled me to my core. There, scratched deep into the rock face above the opening, was a crude drawing, A stick figure with exaggerated horns and cloven hooves. The same image I had seen in the abandoned shepherd's hut, rendered here in the same dried reddish-brown substance that I now realized with sickening certainty was not paint, but blood. And below it, that single terrible word, Scappa. Run. I did not need to be told twice. Despite my exhaustion and injuries, I began to make my way down the mountainside, driven by the certainty that I was not yet safe, that the horrors I had experienced were far from over. As I stumbled down the mountainside, my mind reeled, struggling to process everything I had experienced. The rational part of me insisted that there must be logical explanations. I had become lost, suffered a fall, and my oxygen-deprived brain had conjured terrifying hallucinations in the darkness of the cave. But I couldn't shake the visceral memory of hot breath on my face, of massive claws scraping stone, of those glowing, intelligent eyes watching me from the mist. My progress was slow and painful. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, and my torn, bloodied feet left crimson smears on the rocks with each step. But fear drove me onward, the irrational certainty that if I stopped, something ancient and terrible would emerge from the mountain to claim me. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I began to hear sounds of civilization. The distant rumble of vehicles on a road, the faint bark of a dog. Hope surged through me, giving me a final burst of energy. I pushed through a stand of trees and found myself on the outskirts of a small village nestled in the valley below. The sight of buildings, of other human beings going about their daily lives, nearly brought me to my knees with relief. I staggered into the village square, aware of the shocked stares my appearance elicited from the locals. I must have been quite a sight. Clothes torn to shreds, covered in dirt and blood, wild-eyed with exhaustion and lingering terror. An older man approached me cautiously, concern evident on his weathered face. He spoke to me in rapid Italian, but in my addled state, I couldn't comprehend a word. I managed to croak out a plea for help in English before my legs gave out and the world went dark around me. I awoke sometime later in a hospital bed, disoriented and groggy from pain medication. A nurse explained that I had been brought in suffering from dehydration, exposure, and numerous cuts and bruises. They had treated my injuries and wanted to keep me for observation, concerned about possible head trauma given my confused state upon arrival. As my head cleared, I tried to explain what had happened to me. But even as the words left my mouth, I could see the skepticism in the eyes of the doctors and police officers who came to interview me. They nodded politely, but it was clear they believed I had simply gotten lost in the mountains and injured myself in a fall. No one seemed to take seriously my insistence that something had been stalking me, that I had encountered something in that cave that defied explanation. They spoke to each other in low voices, using words like delirium and hallucinations when they thought I couldn't hear. I was on the verge of giving up, of accepting their rational explanations and trying to convince myself that it had all been a product of my imagination. But then an old man appeared in the doorway of my hospital room, leaning heavily on a gnarled wooden cane. He introduced himself as Giuseppe, a local historian and folklorist. He had overheard the nurses gossiping about the mad foreign hiker and his wild tales, and something about my story had piqued his interest. Giuseppe pulled up a chair beside my bed and, in halting English, began to speak. He told me of old legends, stories passed down through generations of mountain folk, tales of something that lurked in the high, lonely places of the Apuan Alps, something ancient and malevolent that was neither fully animal nor man. The locals had many names for it, he said. Some called it the beast of the mountain, others the demon goat or the horned one. But all the stories shared common elements: its cunning intelligence, its insatiable hunger for human flesh, and the way it toyed with its prey before moving in for the kill. Giuseppe spoke of missing hikers over the years, of mutilated livestock found high in the mountain pastures, of strange tracks found in the snow that matched no known animal. Most dismissed these tales as superstition or attributed them to natural predators. But there were always a few who believed, who warned their children never to stray too far into the mountains alone. As he spoke, Giuseppe's eyes took on a faraway look, as if seeing something beyond the sterile hospital walls. He told me of his own encounter with the creature when he was a young man, of how he had barely escaped with his life. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal a mass of scar tissue on his forearm, 3 parallel gashes that could only have been made by massive, wickedly curved claws. "You are lucky to be alive, my friend," Giuseppe said, his voice grave. "Few who encounter the beast live to tell the tale. And those who do..." He trailed off, shaking his head. I leaned forward, ignoring the pain that shot through my battered body. "Those who do what?" I pressed. Giuseppe met my eyes, and I saw in them a haunted look that I recognized all too well. "Those who survive are never the same," he said softly. "The beast leaves its mark on you, you see. Not just on the body, but on the soul. It follows you even when you leave the mountains behind, in your dreams, in the shadows at the edge of your vision. Always watching, always waiting." A chill ran down my spine as Giuseppe's words sank in. I thought of the strange encounter on the trail to Monteferrato, of the man who had looked at me with such shock and fear. Had he too faced the horrors that lurked in these mountains? Had he recognized in me a fellow survivor, marked in some intangible way by our brush with the incomprehensible? Giuseppe reached out and gripped my hand with surprising strength. "You must be careful now," he warned. "The beast does not forget. It does not forgive those who escape its grasp. It will come for you again when you least expect it." As if to underscore his words, a sudden gust of wind rattled the hospital window. Both Giuseppe and I turned to look, startled by the noise. For just a moment, so briefly I might have imagined it, I thought I saw a dark shape move across the glass, its reflection distorted but unmistakably crowned with wickedly curved horns. When I turned back, Giuseppe was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the chilling certainty that my ordeal in the Apuan Alps was far from over. The days that followed my release from the hospital were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. I had extended my stay in Italy, unable to face the thought of a long flight home in my current state of mind. Instead, I found myself a small rental apartment in a coastal town, far from the looming presence of the mountains that now filled me with such visceral dread. But distance provided little comfort. Giuseppe's warnings echoed in my mind, and I found myself jumping at shadows, convinced that every passing stranger's gaze lingered on me a moment too long. I slept fitfully, plagued by vivid nightmares of lightless caverns and glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. During my waking hours, I threw myself into research, scouring local libraries and the internet for any information I could find about the legends Giuseppe had mentioned. Most sources dismissed the tales as mere folklore, the product of superstitious minds and overactive imaginations. But here and there, I found tantalizing hints that suggested a deeper truth behind the stories. Old newspaper articles reported on mysterious disappearances in the Apuan Alps, hikers and shepherds who vanished without a trace. Local message boards were filled with accounts of strange sightings, glimpses of a large, unidentifiable creature moving with unnatural speed through the forests, or eerie sounds echoing from the mountains late at night. One recurring detail caught my attention: reports of a distinctive marking left behind at the sites of some disappearances or animal mutilations. A crude drawing of a horned bipedal figure, always accompanied by that single chilling word, Scappa. The same image and word I had seen in the shepherd's hut and again outside the cave where I had nearly lost my life. As I delved deeper into my research, I began to notice odd occurrences in my daily life. Items in my apartment would be moved when I wasn't looking, as if someone, or something, had been rifling through my belongings. More than once I woke in the middle of the night with the unshakable feeling that I was being watched. One evening, about 2 weeks after my ordeal in the mountains, I was walking back to my apartment after a late dinner at a local trattoria. The streets were mostly deserted, the town's residents having retreated indoors to escape the chill autumn air. As I turned a corner onto my street, a movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. I whirled around, heart pounding, but saw only empty sidewalks stretching behind me. Yet as I peered into the shadows between buildings, I could have sworn I saw something shift and move, something far larger than any stray cat or dog. I quickened my pace, fumbling for my keys as I approached my apartment building. Just as I reached the entrance, a sound froze me in my tracks. The scrape of claws on stone, unmistakably similar to what I had heard in the cave. It was coming from the narrow alley beside the building. Every instinct screamed at me to run inside, to lock the door and hide. But a perverse curiosity, born perhaps of my desperate need for confirmation that I wasn't going mad, drove me to investigate. Slowly, hesitantly, I edged towards the mouth of the alley. At first, I saw nothing but shadows and discarded trash. Then, my eyes adjusted to the gloom, and I made out a form crouched at the far end of the alley. It was hunched over something, and with a surge of nausea, I realized it was feeding, tearing into what looked horribly like the carcass of a large dog. As if sensing my presence, the creature's head snapped up. Two glowing eyes, the same eyes that had haunted my nightmares for weeks, fixed on me with predatory intensity. The thing rose to its full height, easily 7 feet tall, its proportions a nightmarish blend of human and animal. For an eternal moment we stared at each other, predator and prey frozen in a tableau of terror. Then with a speed that defied its size, the creature lunged towards me. I turned and ran, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted for the apartment building entrance. I could hear the monster's labored breathing behind me, feel the rush of displaced air as wickedly curved claws swiped at my back. I slammed through the door and up the stairs, not daring to look back. Only when I was inside my apartment, door locked and bolted, did I allow myself to collapse, gasping for breath and shaking uncontrollably. For hours I huddled in my bedroom, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Eventually, exhaustion overcame terror, and I fell into a fitful sleep. I awoke the next morning half convinced that it had all been another vivid nightmare. But when I finally worked up the courage to venture outside, I found unmistakable proof that the encounter had been all too real. There, scratched deep into the wood of my apartment door, was that now familiar crude drawing of a horned figure. And below it, gouged with savage intensity, that single word that had become the stuff of my nightmares: Scappa. In that moment, I knew with sickening certainty that Giuseppe had been right. The beast had followed me from the mountains. It had found me. And it would not rest until it had finished what it had started in those dark caves beneath the Apuan Alps. The discovery of the marking on my door shattered any remaining doubt or denial I had been clinging to. The beast was real. It had found me, and I was no longer safe. I spent the day in a frenzy of activity, packing my meager belongings and making arrangements to leave Italy as soon as possible. As I worked, my mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. Where could I go that the creature couldn't follow? How could I protect myself against something that seemed to defy the laws of nature? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that running might not be enough. If I wanted to truly be free of this nightmare, I would need to find a way to confront the beast and end its reign of terror once and for all. But I knew I couldn't face this threat alone. I needed allies, people who would believe my story and help me fight back against the monster that stalked me. With trembling hands, I picked up my phone and dialed Giuseppe's number. The old man answered on the third ring, his voice wary. I quickly explained what had happened, my words tumbling out in a frantic jumble. To his credit, Giuseppe didn't question my sanity or dismiss my claims. Instead, he listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification on certain details. When I finished my account, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Giuseppe spoke. his voice grave. "You were right to call me," he said. "What you face is more dangerous than you know. The beast is not just a creature of flesh and blood, but something far older and more terrible. It has stalked these mountains for centuries, perhaps millennia, and now that it has marked you, it will not stop until it claims your life, or you find a way to destroy it." My heart sank at his words, but I forced myself to focus on solutions. "How do we fight it?" I asked. "There must be some way to kill it, or at least drive it away." Giuseppe sighed heavily. "There are methods," he said hesitantly. "Ways to combat creatures of darkness that have been passed down through generations. But they are dangerous, and there is no guarantee of success. Are you certain you want to pursue this path? It may be safer to run, to try to lose the beast's trail." I thought of the terror I had experienced in the cave, of the way the creature had toyed with me before moving in for the kill. The idea of spending the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, never knowing when those glowing eyes might appear in the darkness, was unbearable. "I'm sure," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I can't live like this. I need to end it one way or another." There was another long pause before Giuseppe responded. "Very well," he said at last. "Meet me tomorrow at dawn in the village of Levigliani. Bring whatever weapons you can acquire, silver if possible, and pray to whatever gods you believe in that we are not already too late." As I hung up the phone, a mix of fear and determination coursed through me. Tomorrow I would begin my journey back into the heart of the Apuan Alps, back to the lair of the beast that had nearly claimed my life. But this time, I would not be prey. This time, I would be the hunter. The village of Levigliani was shrouded in mist as I arrived, the first pale light of dawn barely penetrating the gloom. Giuseppe was waiting for me in the town square, a grim expression on his weathered face. He carried a battered leather satchel and leaned heavily on his cane, but there was a fierce determination in his eyes that belied his age. "Are you ready?" he asked without preamble as I approached. I nodded, trying to project a confidence I didn't entirely feel. "As ready as I'll ever be." Giuseppe led me to a small chapel on the outskirts of the village. Inside, he opened his satchel and began laying out an assortment of items on the altar: bundles of herbs, vials of dark liquid, and several wicked-looking silver daggers. "These are the tools of those who hunt the darkness," he explained as he worked. "Passed down through generations of my family. I had hoped never to use them, but it seems fate has other plans." As Giuseppe instructed me in the use of the various implements, he shared what he knew of the beast's origins. According to legend, it was an ancient entity, neither fully animal nor demon, that had haunted the Apuan Alps since time immemorial. It fed not just on the flesh of its victims, but on their fear and suffering. "The beast is cunning," Giuseppe warned. "It will try to confuse you, to make you doubt your senses and your sanity. You must stay focused on your goal, no matter what horrors you may face." With our preparations complete, we set out into the mountains. The fog grew thicker as we ascended, muffling all sound and limiting visibility to mere feet in front of us. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing, convinced that at any moment the beast would emerge from the mist to attack. As we neared the area where I had first encountered the creature, an unnatural stillness fell over the forest. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. It was as if all other life had fled, leaving only us and the ancient predator that lurked in the shadows. Suddenly, Giuseppe grabbed my arm, pulling me to a stop. He pointed silently at a nearby tree trunk. There, carved into the bark, was that now familiar crude drawing of a horned figure. The warning, Scappa, seemed to glow with a reddish light in the gloom. "We are close," Giuseppe whispered. "Be ready for anything." No sooner had the words left his mouth than a bone-chilling roar shattered the silence. A massive shape burst from the undergrowth, moving with impossible speed. I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of wickedly curved horns, of eyes that burned with inhuman intelligence and malice. What followed was a nightmarish blur of violence and terror. Giuseppe and I fought desperately, our silver blades flashing in the dim light as we struggled against a foe that seemed to shrug off wounds that would have felled any mortal creature. The beast was everywhere at once, its claws raking furrows in tree trunks and flesh alike. In the chaos of the battle, I lost track of Giuseppe. I found myself being driven back, deeper into the forest, the beast herding me towards some unknown destination. With a sickening lurch of recognition, I realized where we were headed, the entrance to the cave system where I had nearly lost my life weeks before. As we neared the yawning mouth of the cave, I made a desperate gamble. I hurled one of the vials Giuseppe had given me directly at the beast's face. The glass shattered, and the creature let out a howl of pain and fury as the blessed liquid within seared its flesh. Taking advantage of its momentary distraction, I darted past the beast and into the cave. I had a wild, half-formed plan: to lure the creature into the narrow passages where its size would work against it, to find some way to trap or destroy it in the lightless depths that had nearly claimed me before. What followed was a nightmarish game of cat and mouse through pitch-black tunnels and vast, echoing caverns. I could hear the beast pursuing me, its bestial breathing and the scrape of its claws on stone growing ever closer. My only advantages were my smaller size and my desperate, adrenaline-fueled speed. Finally, I found myself in a familiar chamber, the same room where I had wedged myself into a crevice to escape the beast during my first encounter. But this time, I didn't hide. Instead, I planted my feet and faced the entrance, Giuseppe's silver dagger clutched tightly in my trembling hand. The beast's massive form filled the passageway, its glowing eyes fixed on me with predatory intensity. For a moment, we stood frozen, predator and prey locked in a final confrontation. Then, with a roar that shook dust from the ceiling, it charged. What happened next is a blur in my memory, a frantic whirl of slashing claws and flashing silver. I remember the searing pain as the beast's talons raked across my chest, the jarring impact as I was slammed against the cavern wall. But most of all, I remember the moment when my dagger found its mark, sinking deep into the creature's throat. The beast's roar turned into a gurgling shriek. It thrashed wildly, black blood pouring from the wound. I clung to the hilt of the dagger with all my remaining strength, driving it deeper, praying that it would be enough. With a final, earth-shaking bellow, the beast collapsed. Its massive form shuddered once, twice, and then was still. The glowing light faded from its eyes, leaving nothing but empty, glazed orbs staring sightlessly at the cavern ceiling. For a long moment, I stood there, gasping for breath, unable to believe that it was truly over. Then, the realization of what I had accomplished washed over me in a wave of relief so intense it nearly brought me to my knees. I stumbled out of the cave on shaky legs, emerging into the late afternoon sunlight. Giuseppe was there, battered and bloodied but alive, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked at me with a mixture of awe and relief. "It is done?" he asked softly. I nodded, too exhausted for words. Giuseppe's face broke into a weary smile. "Then let us leave this cursed place," he said. "The mountains have kept their secrets for millennia. Let them keep this one as well." As we made our way slowly down the mountainside, I felt as if a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The nightmare that had consumed my life for weeks was over. The beast of the Apuan Alps was dead. Its reign of terror ended at last. But even as relief flooded through me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. I had faced the impossible, had stared into the abyss, and emerged victorious. But the experience had left its mark on me, as surely as if the beast had branded me with its claws. I knew that I would never be able to look at the world in quite the same way again. The comfortable certainties of my old life had been shattered, replaced by the knowledge that there were things lurking in the shadows that defied rational explanation. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, I silently vowed to use what I had learned, to seek out other hidden truths, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves from the horrors that lurked in the dark places of the world. My Uncle Henry bought the 25 acres of forest land in the Pacific Northwest about 40 years ago. He was drawn to the remote wilderness, a place to hunt, fish, and live off the grid like in the old days. But there was always something unsettling about that property, an eerie presence that made you feel like you were never truly alone, even when the nearest human soul was miles away. The land had a dark history that seemed to cling to the towering pines and sprawling underbrush. Long before my uncle arrived, it had been the site of an old logging camp notorious for grisly accidents and inexplicable disappearances. Locals swapped sinister stories about the place. Uncle Henry brushed them off as tall tales, but I think even he sensed there was more to it. Going back even further, there were whispers that early settlers had conducted pagan rituals in those woods, evidenced by ancient symbols gouged into the oldest trees and strange stone circles hidden in the thickets. The native Salish tribes had long avoided the area, calling it the place of the shadow. They understood that there were dark forces there that should never be disturbed. But my stubborn uncle was determined to make the land his own. With his bare hands, he constructed a rough-hewn cabin that groaned and swayed when the wind kicked up. He added a smokehouse and a lookout tower, as if staking his claim. Yet no matter what structures he erected, that land stayed wild and untamed, almost as if it was actively fighting against domestication. Whenever I explored the property on my own as a kid, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The deeper I wandered into the woods, the colder the air would turn, sending a chill through my bones that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was an innate, primal sensation of some unseen thing stalking me, a dread that seeped into my stomach and made my hair stand on end. I still vividly remember the first time I realized there was something unnatural lurking in those woods. I was about 12 or 13 years old, walking along an overgrown game trail when I heard a soft whimpering sound coming from the undergrowth. For a moment I thought it might be our old dog Buck, who had passed away over a year ago. But when I turned toward the sound, I froze. There in the shadows stood Buck, or what appeared to be him at first glance. Patches of fur were missing from his emaciated body, but it was his eyes that sent pure terror flooding through my veins. Instead of warm, familiar brown, they were a sickly pale yellow. They almost seemed to glow with a predatory light as he stared right through me. We stood locked in that macabre tableau for what felt like an eternity, neither of us moving, before the nightmarish vision of Buck suddenly turned and disappeared into the forest. I ran back to the cabin in a panic, my heart slamming against my ribs and blood roaring in my ears. Uncle Henry tried to assure me it was just my mind playing tricks when I recounted what I had seen. But I knew, deep in my bones, that it was no mere hallucination. There was something out there in those woods, and it resented our presence. The years began to slip by, but the land never warmed to us. More and more, it felt like we were unwelcome guests, merely tolerated by whatever ancient presence dwelled there. Strange things would happen, minor at first, then escalating. It was like the land was testing our resolve, trying to drive us away. In the winter of 2023, Uncle Henry and my cousin Will were spending most weekends at the cabin, determined to make it a place of respite and retreat. But each visit seemed to agitate and embolden the entity in the woods. One frigid morning, they returned to town, ashen-faced and shaken to their core. Something had fundamentally unnerved them out there. It took some coaxing, but Uncle Henry finally revealed what they had found on the cabin's front steps. A shocking display of animal bones meticulously arranged in an elaborate pattern. It resembled a pentagram with additional interlocking lines crisscrossing through the center. The unnatural geometry was too precise to be the work of scavengers. He tried to rationalize it away, but the doubt and dread was apparent in his haunted eyes. Disturbing discoveries continued to plague the cabin. Deep, jagged scratches marred the exterior walls like some massive clawed hand had raked down the wood. They stretched all the way up to the eaves, far beyond the reach of any known woodland creature. Unnerved but determined to get to the bottom of the escalating disturbances, Will set up several motion-activated cameras around the structure before their next trip out. He was hopeful they would capture footage of the culprit, be it man or beast. But when they reviewed the recordings back at the cabin, an icy sense of dread washed over them. Most of the playback was filled with eerie static and inexplicable flashes of light that obscured the picture, as if the cameras had malfunctioned during the night. It defied explanation. However, buried in the electronic snow, there was a single bone-chilling frame. For a split second, the image of a ghastly silhouette was visible at the edge of the clearing. Tall and skeletally thin with elongated limbs, its proportions were hideously inhuman. In the blink of an eye, the apparition darted out of frame with a jolting, unnatural swiftness that made my skin crawl. Uncle Henry tried to downplay it, but Will was rattled to his core. He swore what he saw was not of this earth. The cameras all inexplicably died soon after, their batteries drained despite being freshly replaced. Another ominous sign. The most blood-curdling incident occurred while Uncle Henry was keeping watch from the lookout tower late one moonless night. The woods had fallen still, smothered by an unnerving silence heavy with foreboding. Suddenly, the deathly quiet was shattered by a chilling sound, the whisper of a voice calling his name. It came on the wind, soft yet insidious, worming its way into his mind. With growing horror, he recognized the voice. It belonged to his brother, my other uncle, who had passed away years prior. The spectral whisper urged him to descend from the tower, each syllable burrowing into his psyche like some malevolent hypnosis. In a fugue-like trance, he nearly complied, his legs carrying him toward the ladder. Then, as if some unseen hand had snapped its fingers, the whispers abruptly ceased, and clarity came rushing back. It took all his strength of will not to crumple onto the rough boards in terror. Uncle Henry didn't dare share this particular experience with Will, but I saw it in his haunted eyes, in the new lines etched into his weathered face. Whatever evil lurked on that land was escalating, growing bolder. It craved our fear, our suffering. It wanted to destroy us. The following weekend, Will reached a breaking point. He couldn't endure living in a constant state of dread anymore, jumping at shadows and going to sleep wondering if he would awake. Mustering his courage, he announced his intention to explore the rarely visited far reaches of the property and confront this malevolent force head-on. I couldn't let my cousin venture out there alone, not with so much unknown danger potentially awaiting him. Despite my every instinct screaming not to set foot back on that cursed land, I volunteered to accompany him. Perhaps if we faced this horror together, we could break its hold over us and reclaim some semblance of peace. As we set out into the forest, an oppressive sense of being watched, of being hunted, bore down on us like a physical weight. The woods seemed to twist and undulate around us, ancient tree limbs reaching out like gnarled hands. Grotesquely twisted roots and vines snaked across the forest floor, determined to ensnare us. Even the air itself felt different, thick and cloying, as if we were inhaling the breath of something long dead. Deeper and deeper we pressed on until we reached a small, somber clearing choked by shadow despite the midday sun. And that's when we saw it. A sight that will haunt me until my dying breath. Graves. Dozens of them arranged in neat rows. Crude markers of stacked stones rose from each mound of freshly disturbed earth, like the rotten teeth of some slumbering leviathan. The graveyard radiated a bone-deep sense of wrongness. It repelled the human spirit, seeming to feed off our mounting terror. Will and I stood at the threshold as if frozen, souls quailing at the sheer malevolence saturating the very soil. A primal intuition far older than reason screamed that we were trespassing on unholy ground, that our very presence was an affront to the forces that held dominion here. I could feel the land's anger simmering beneath our feet, a wrath that stretched back epochs. It yearned to reach up and drag us down into its rotting embrace, to subsume us into the nightmare. Will voiced what we both instinctively knew. This was a place not meant for the living. We needed to flee and never look back. Yet even as we agreed to retreat, an unseen miasma seemed to press in around us, silently taunting, daring us to take a step further. It was a siren's call, beguiling and deadly. It took every ounce of our willpower to turn our backs on that atrocity, to resist the insidious pull. Fueled by mortal dread, we beat a hasty path back toward the relative safety of the cabin, not daring to glance behind us. The whole way it felt as if 1,000 unseen eyes bore into our backs, coveting our souls. Uncle Henry initially dismissed our claims about the graves, unable to conceive of such a macabre thing existing on his land. But Will would not relent, pleading with him to at least come and bear witness with his own eyes. At first light, he grudgingly obliged, bringing along a metal detector. Perhaps he thought it might lend some rational explanation to the irrational horror we described. But as he stood at the edge of that unhallowed plot, passing the device over the earth, an icy revelation awaited. The metal detector remained eerily silent as it swept over grave after grave. No pipe, no belt buckle, no wedding ring to mark the resting places of the forgotten dead interred there. It was as if whatever lay beneath the soil was so ancient, it predated the rise of metalworking. But when Uncle Henry reached the final sepulcher set apart from the others, the machine erupted into a frenzy of shrill beeping, needles spiking into the red. There was something down there in that grave, something unnatural, and it did not want to be disturbed. The air around us turned putrid and dense, reeking of centuries of rot. It invaded our lungs and clung to our skin. The woods fell impossibly silent and still as if in anticipation. A private battle of wills raged behind Uncle Henry's eyes as he hefted the shovel, torn between the need to know and the visceral urge to flee. In the end, the wiser part of him prevailed. Will and I vehemently protested any attempt to exhume whatever nightmares lay sleeping in that land. To invite them into the light was to court utter madness and oblivion. To his credit, Uncle Henry relented. Even his stubborn pride was no match for the denizens of that necropolis. We left those graves to their eternal secrets and made our subdued way back to the cabin. The forest seemed to shudder in our wake, a long-held breath finally expelled. But whether it was from relief or hatred, I could not say. After that harrowing day, Uncle Henry never slept another night in the cabin. He took to residing in his camper van parked close to the main road, as near to civilization as the property permitted. An unspoken acceptance that there were some forces beyond reckoning settled over him like a shroud. As for Will, he vowed never to set foot on the land again, and I couldn't fault him for it. Whatever slumbered in those ancient woods, it was a darkness not meant for mortal minds to challenge. Merely being in its presence risked inviting an unrelenting doom. In the years since, I too have given that forsaken place a wide berth, yet its shadow lingers at the edges of my consciousness. Often I lay awake in the still of night, gripped by a nebulous but unshakable dread, wondering if the whispering voices from the graves will find me even here. Sometimes, in that liminal space between sleep and waking, I fancy I can feel an icy breath on the back of my neck and the phantom brush of fleshless fingers against my skin. It chills me to my marrow. Whatever evil dwells on that land, I know it is patient. I know it hungers. And I pray I never live to see the day it is unleashed upon the world. For I fear that even death would be no escape from the horrors lurking in the shadow of the woods. The warm July evening wrapped around me like a soft blanket as I stood on the porch of my family's lakeside cabin, gazing out at the dense forest that surrounded us. The sun was dipping below the tree line, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink. It was beautiful, peaceful even, but an undercurrent of restlessness tugged at me. "Come on, Sam. Are you ready or what?" Zoe's impatient voice cut through my reverie. I turned to see her bounding down the wooden steps, her backpack slung over one shoulder and a mischievous glint in her eyes. I hesitated, my hand resting on the porch railing. "I don't know, Zoe. Maybe we should just stay here tonight. We could watch a movie or something." Zoe rolled her eyes dramatically. "Seriously? We've been cooped up in this cabin all week. Don't you want to do something exciting for once?" I sighed, knowing I was fighting a losing battle. Zoe had a way of talking me into things, and I had a way of letting her. It wasn't that I wanted to break the rules. My parents had been clear about not wandering into the woods after dark. But the allure of adventure, of doing something thrilling and forbidden, was hard to resist. "Fine," I conceded, grabbing my own backpack from where it leaned against the porch post. "But we're not staying out too late, okay?" Zoe's face lit up with triumph. "Deal." "Trust me, Sam, you're going to love it. The view from the fire tower is incredible." As we set off down the dirt road leading away from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a mistake. The old, abandoned fire tower had been a topic of whispered conversations among the local kids all summer. Some said it was the best lookout point in the county. Others warned it was dangerous, with rotting stairs and unstable platforms. The dirt road stretched out before us, curving slightly before disappearing into the thick woods. On either side, tall pines stood like silent sentinels, their branches forming a canopy overhead that seemed to swallow what little remaining daylight there was. The air grew cooler as we walked, filled with the earthy scent of damp soil and pine needles. "How far is it again?" I asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. "Not too far," Zoe replied, her ponytail swinging as she walked. "Maybe a couple of miles? We'll be there before you know it." As we continued down the road, the shadows lengthened and deepened around us. The chirping of birds gave way to the ersta sounds of nocturnal creatures stirring. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing eerily through the trees. Suddenly, a low rumble reached my ears. At first, I thought it might be thunder, but the sky above was clear, stars just beginning to twinkle into view. The sound grew louder, resolving into the unmistakable growl of an engine. I turned to Zoe, my heart rate picking up. "Do you hear that?" She nodded, her earlier bravado faltering slightly. "It's probably just someone heading back to their cabin. No big deal." But as the sound drew nearer, a prickle of unease crawled up my spine. Headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the gathering gloom. The vehicle approached slowly, the engine's rumble becoming a menacing growl in the quiet evening. It was an old pickup truck, its once red paint now a patchwork of rust and peeling metal. The headlights illuminated us harshly as it drew level, and I found myself squinting against the glare. The truck slowed to a crawl beside us. Through the dusty windshield, I could make out 3 men crammed into the cab. The driver, a wiry man with a scruffy beard, leaned out of his window. He said nothing, just stared at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Beside him, a heavy-set man chewed on something, his jaw working methodically as his gaze roved over us. In the back, a third man leaned forward, an unsettling grin spread across his face. Zoe's elbow dug into my ribs. "Keep walking," she hissed under her breath. We picked up our pace, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet seeming obscenely loud in the tense silence. The truck inched forward, keeping pace with us for a moment before the driver finally broke his unnerving stare and looked ahead. The vehicle moved past us, but instead of continuing down the road, it pulled over to the shoulder just a few yards ahead. The engine idled, a low, threatening rumble in the growing darkness. "We should hurry," I whispered to Zoe, my earlier misgivings now full-blown anxiety. She nodded, her earlier excitement replaced by wide-eyed wariness. We quickened our steps, giving the truck as wide a berth as the narrow road would allow. As we passed, I could feel the weight of the men's stares on us, though I didn't dare look directly at them. Once past the truck, we practically jogged down the road. The sound of the idling engine faded behind us, but the knot of fear in my stomach didn't loosen. The woods seemed different now, no longer simply dark and mysterious, but actively menacing. Maybe we should go back, I suggested, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. Zoe shook her head firmly. We're almost to the trailhead. It'll be fine. Those guys were just trying to scare us. I wasn't convinced, but I followed Zoe as she veered off the main road onto a barely visible path. A broken wooden sign, its lettering almost obscured by moss, marked the start of the trail to the fire tower. As we plunged into the deeper darkness of the forest, leaving the relative openness of the road behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees pressed in close on either side of the narrow trail, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. The beam of my flashlight seemed pitifully inadequate against the vast, pressing darkness of the forest. Zoe forged ahead, her own light bobbing steadily in front of us, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. We had been walking for perhaps 15 minutes when I heard it, the distant but unmistakable sound of an engine roaring to life. Zoe and I exchanged a panicked look. "Run," she said, and we took off down the trail, our feet pounding against the earth, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The sound of the engine grew louder, accompanied now by the cracking of branches and the squeal of tires on uneven ground. They were coming after us, and they weren't sticking to the road. Terror lent wings to our feet as we crashed through the underbrush, abandoning the trail in our desperation to escape. Branches whipped at our faces and arms, roots threatened to trip us at every step, but we didn't slow down. The truck's headlights cut through the trees behind us, casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to reach out to grab us. Voices carried on the night air, rough, angry shouts that made my blood run cold. "We can't outrun them," I gasped, my lungs burning. Zoe's eyes darted around wildly before fixing on something in the distance. "There," she pointed. "The fire tower. We can climb up. They won't be able to follow us." Ahead, barely visible through the trees, loomed the skeletal frame of the old fire tower. It looked even more decrepit and dangerous than I had imagined, but right then, it was our only hope. We burst out of the tree line into the small clearing at the base of the tower. Behind us, the truck's engine roared closer. Without hesitation, we sprinted for the tower's rusted metal staircase. The steps groaned and swayed alarmingly under our weight as we climbed. I didn't dare look down, focusing only on Zoe's shoes in front of me and the next step above. We had barely reached the first platform when the truck crashed into the clearing below. Doors slammed, and rough voices called out. "Nowhere to run now, kids," one of the men shouted, his tone a mixture of anger and cruel amusement. Zoe tugged at my arm. "Keep climbing," she urged. Higher and higher we went, the old tower creaking and shuddering with each step. The voices below grew more distant, but the fear of the rickety structure collapsing beneath us was almost as terrifying as the men pursuing us. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we reached the topmost platform. It was little more than a small square of rusted metal with a low railing, swaying slightly in the night breeze. Gasping for breath, we peered over the edge. Far below, we could see the men gathered at the base of the tower. One of them had started up the stairs but quickly retreated when the whole structure groaned ominously. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice trembling. Zoe's face was pale in the moonlight, but her jaw was set with determination. "We wait them out. They can't stay down there forever." As we huddled together on that precarious perch, the night stretching endlessly around us and danger lurking below, I realized that our adventure had become something far more terrifying than we could have ever imagined. and the night was far from over. The old fire tower creaked and swayed beneath us, a constant reminder of just how precarious our situation was. From our vantage point high above the forest floor, we could see for miles in every direction, an endless sea of treetops under a star-studded sky. Any other time, it might have been breathtaking. Now, it only emphasized how isolated and vulnerable we were. I gripped the rusted railing tightly, my knuckles white, as another gust of wind set the entire structure trembling. "Zoe," I whispered, not daring to raise my voice. "We can't stay up here all night." She nodded, her face a mask of concentration as she peered down at the base of the tower. The men were still there, their indistinct figures moving around the clearing. The red glow of a cigarette ember flared briefly in the darkness. "Maybe they'll give up soon," Zoe said, but her tone lacked conviction. As if in response to her words, a gravelly voice floated up from below. "You can't stay up there forever, kids. Why don't you come on down and we can have a nice chat?" A burst of laughter followed, cruel and mocking. I felt my stomach churn with fear. "Fat chance," Zoe muttered under her breath. Then, louder, she called down, "Leave us alone. We haven't done anything to you." There was a moment of silence. Then the same voice replied, a hint of menace creeping into its fake joviality. Now, don't be like that. We just want to make sure you get home safe. These woods can be dangerous at night." I exchanged a terrified look with Zoe. The threat in those words was unmistakable. "What do they want with us?" I whispered, my mind racing through horrible possibilities. Zoe shook her head, her earlier bravado crumbling. "I don't know, Sam. I don't know." We lapsed into silence, straining our ears for any sound of movement from below. The night seemed to press in around us, the darkness beyond the small circle of our flashlight beams absolute and oppressive. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we heard the slam of a car door. The truck's engine roared to life, headlights sweeping across the trees as it reversed out of the clearing. For a moment, hope surged through me. Are they leaving? But Zoe's expression remained grim. "I don't think so. Listen." The sound of the engine faded, but didn't disappear entirely. It idled somewhere nearby, just out of sight. "They're waiting us out," Zoe said, her voice barely above a whisper. The realization settled over us like a heavy blanket. We were trapped, suspended between the threat below and the perilous height above. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped. The wind picked up, whistling through the tower's metal framework and chilling us to the bone. We huddled together for warmth, our backs pressed against the central pole of the platform. Every creak and groan of the tower sent a fresh spike of fear through me. The structure was old and neglected. How long could it really hold up? And even if it didn't collapse, how long could we stay up here? We had no food, no water, and the small platform offered no shelter from the elements. "I'm sorry," Zoe said suddenly, breaking the long silence. "This is all my fault. I should never have talked you into coming out here." I wanted to be angry with her, to blame her for the nightmare we found ourselves in, but I couldn't. "We both made the choice," I said instead. "We'll figure a way out of this." She gave me a wan smile, but I could see the guilt and fear warring in her eyes. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, we heard movement below. Peering cautiously over the railing, we saw two of the men emerge from the tree line. They looked up at us, their faces indistinct in the pre-dawn gloom. "Rise and shine, kiddos," one of them called up, his tone mockingly cheerful. "Ready to come down and join us for breakfast?" Zoe's hand found mine, squeezing tightly. "What do we do?" she whispered. I shook my head, at a loss. We couldn't stay up here indefinitely, but the thought of descending into the waiting arms of those men filled me with dread. As the sun slowly rose, painting the sky in pale pinks and golds, we were faced with an impossible choice. Stay and risk exposure, dehydration, or the collapse of the tower itself, or descend into unknown but certain danger. The beauty of the sunrise stood in stark contrast to the terror of our situation. As I looked out over the awakening forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened next would change our lives forever. The night had been long and frightening, but I had a sinking feeling that the true ordeal was only just beginning. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, its warmth a cruel mockery of the cold fear that gripped us. From our perch atop the fire tower, we watched as the men below grew restless, pacing the small clearing and occasionally calling up taunts or false assurances. "We can't stay up here," I said, my throat dry and scratchy from thirst. "We'll die of exposure if they don't leave soon." Zoe nodded grimly, her face pale and drawn after our sleepless night. "I know. But if we go down there..." She didn't need to finish the thought. We both knew the danger that awaited us on the ground. As we debated our limited options, a new sound reached our ears. The distant but unmistakable whop-whop-whop of helicopter blades. Hope surged through me as I scanned the horizon, searching for the source of the sound. "There!" Zoe pointed, her voice rising with excitement. A small dot was visible in the distance, growing larger as it approached. Our elation was short-lived, however. The men below had also heard the helicopter. They conferred briefly, their voices too low for us to make out the words. Then two of them quickly disappeared into the woods. The third remained at the base of the tower, looking up at us with a mixture of frustration and calculation in his eyes. The helicopter drew nearer, and now we could see it was a news chopper, probably out doing a routine traffic report for the morning commute. It wasn't heading directly for us, but it would pass close enough that we might be able to signal for help. "We have to try," I said, already shrugging off my jacket. "If we can get their attention..." Zoe nodded, her own jacket in hand. As the helicopter approached, we began waving frantically, our jackets flapping like flags in the morning breeze. "Hey, over here!" we shouted, our voices hoarse but desperate. "Help us!" For a heart-stopping moment, I thought the helicopter would pass us by without noticing, but then it banked slightly, turning toward the fire tower. A surge of relief washed over me as it drew closer. Our hope was shattered by the crack of a gunshot. The helicopter veered sharply away, quickly retreating back the way it had come. Looking down, I saw the man at the base of the tower lowering a rifle, a satisfied smirk on his face. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They were willing to go to extreme lengths to keep us isolated. "Did he just shoot at the helicopter?" Zoe whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, unable to find words. The gravity of our situation crashed down upon us anew. These men weren't just trying to scare us or play some twisted game. They were dangerous, potentially deadly. The man with the rifle called up to us, his voice casual as if he hadn't just fired a weapon. "Now, that wasn't very neighborly of you two, was it? Trying to bring unwanted attention to our little gathering here." Zoe and I exchanged terrified glances. The pretense of helping us get home safely had been dropped entirely. "Listen," the man continued, his tone hardening. "You've got two choices. You can come down here on your own, or we can make you come down. Either way, this little standoff ends now." As if to emphasize his point, he fired another shot. This one struck the metal framework of the tower near our platform, sending a shower of rust flakes into the air. The entire structure shuddered ominously. "He's going to shoot the tower apart," I realized aloud, panic rising in my throat. Zoe grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We have to go down," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we stay up here, we'll fall to our deaths when the tower collapses." I wanted to argue, to find another solution, but I knew she was right. We were out of options. "Okay," I called down, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're coming down. Just Just don't shoot anymore. The man lowered his rifle, that unsettling smirk still on his face. Smart choice, kids. Nice and easy now. With shaking hands and leaden feet, we began our descent. Each step on the rusted metal stairs felt like it might be our last, both from the deteriorating structure and the fear of what awaited us below. As we neared the bottom, the other two men emerged from the woods, flanking the base of the tower. Their expressions were a mix of triumph and something darker, more predatory. My foot touched solid ground, and immediately rough hands grabbed my arms, yanking me away from the tower. Beside me, Zoe let out a startled yelp as she received the same treatment. "There now," the man with the rifle said, stepping closer. In the harsh light of day, I could see his features clearly. Weathered skin, cold blue eyes, and a scar running along his jawline. That wasn't so bad, was it? "What do you want with us?" Zoe demanded, her voice quavering despite her attempt at bravery. The man chuckled, the sound devoid of any real humor. "Want? Oh, we've got plans for you two. You're going to help us with a little project." A chill ran down my spine at his words. Whatever project these men had in mind, I was certain it was nothing good. "Now," the man continued, gesturing to his companions, "let's get moving. We've got a long walk ahead of us." As they began to lead us away from the tower and deeper into the woods, I caught Zoe's eye. The fear I saw there mirrored my own, but beneath it was a glimmer of determination. Whatever happened next, we would face it together. The forest swallowed us, the fire tower disappearing behind a wall of trees. With each step, we moved further from safety and deeper into a nightmare neither of us could have imagined when we set out on our ill-fated adventure the night before. The forest seemed to close in around us as we were marched deeper into its depths. The men flanked us on all sides, their presence a constant looming threat. The one with the rifle, who seemed to be the leader, walked slightly ahead, occasionally glancing back to ensure we were keeping pace. I tried to memorize our route, looking for landmarks or anything that might help us find our way back if we managed to escape. But the trees all looked the same, an endless sea of green and brown that blurred together in my panicked mind. Beside me, Zoe stumbled on a root, nearly falling. The man closest to her grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her upright. "Careful now," he sneered. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself before we get where we're going." "And where exactly is that?" I asked, immediately regretting drawing attention to myself as the men's eyes swiveled to me. The leader paused, turning to face us with that unsettling smirk. "Curious one, aren't you? Let's just say we've got a nice little setup deep in these woods. Somewhere no one will think to look for you." My blood ran cold at his words. How long had they been out here? How many others had they taken? We walked for what felt like hours, the terrain growing steadily more rugged. The well-worn trails gave way to barely there animal paths, then to no path at all. We climbed steep inclines, scrambled over fallen logs, and waded through shallow streams. The physical exertion, combined with our lack of sleep and the constant state of fear, was taking its toll. My legs felt like lead, and each breath burned in my lungs. Zoe didn't look much better, her face pale and drawn, her steps becoming more unsteady. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, we emerged into a small clearing. At its center stood a dilapidated cabin, its wood weathered gray with age. Surrounding it were several smaller structures, sheds or outbuildings, their purposes unclear. "Home sweet home," the leader announced, gesturing grandly at the ramshackle scene before us. As we approached the cabin, I noticed details that sent a chill down my spine. The windows were boarded up from the inside. A heavy padlock secured the door. This wasn't just some hunter's cabin or wilderness retreat. It was a prison. One of the men moved ahead to unlock the door, while the others kept a firm grip on Zoe and me. As the door swung open with a creak, a musty, stale odor wafted out. "Ladies first," the leader said, motioning for us to enter. Zoe balked, digging her heels into the dirt. "No," she said, her voice small but defiant. "We're not going in there." The leader's smirk disappeared, replaced by a look of cold anger. I wasn't asking. He nodded to his companions, who began to force us forward. I struggled against the iron grip on my arms, but it was useless. They were too strong, too determined. As we were shoved across the threshold into the dim interior of the cabin, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart stop. Scratched into the wooden door frame were tally marks, dozens of them grouped in sets of 5. A record of days, of victims. The door slammed shut behind us, the sound of the padlock clicking into place, sealing our fate. We were trapped, at the mercy of men who clearly had no intention of letting us go. The inside of the cabin was sparse and grimy. A few pieces of mismatched furniture were scattered about. A sagging couch, a rickety table with chairs, a wood stove in the corner. A narrow hallway led to what I assumed were bedrooms or other areas we couldn't see. "Get comfortable," the leader said, his tone mockingly hospitable. "You're going to be here for a while." "Our parents will be looking for us," Zoe said, her voice shaking but determined. "People will notice we're missing." The man laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Oh, I'm counting on it. In fact, that's part of the plan." He turned to his companions. "Secure them, then we'll make the call." Before we could react, rough hands grabbed us again. We were dragged down the hallway and into a small, windowless room. The only furniture was a set of bunk beds with bare, stained mattresses. "Sweet dreams," one of the men sneered as they slammed the door shut. The sound of a lock engaging echoed in the tiny space. Alone at last, Zoe and I sank onto the lower bunk, the reality of our situation crashing down upon us. We were prisoners, held by men who clearly had some larger scheme in mind. And we were powerless to stop whatever they had planned. "What are we going to do?" Zoe whispered, her earlier bravado crumbling as tears began to fall. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, trying to provide comfort even as my own fear threatened to overwhelm me. "We'll figure something out," I said, not believing my own words. "We have to." As we sat there in the gloom, listening to the muffled sounds of our captors moving about the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. Whatever these men had in store for us, I was certain it was only the beginning of a nightmare that would test us in ways we could never have imagined. Time became a blur in our windowless prison. With no way to track the passing of day and night, we were left disoriented and increasingly desperate. The men would bring us food and water at irregular intervals, sometimes what felt like hours apart, other times after what seemed like an eternity of waiting. During one of these visits, I managed to catch a glimpse of a newspaper one of the men was carrying. The headline made my blood run cold. "Search continues for missing teens." Beneath it was a photo of Zoe and me, smiling and carefree, a stark contrast to our current situation. "They're looking for us," I whispered to Zoe after the men had left. "Our family's the police. They know we're missing." She nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "That's good, right? They'll find us eventually." I wasn't so sure. The men seemed unconcerned about the search, which made me wonder just how well hidden this cabin really was. Our captors mostly left us alone, but occasionally the leader, whose name we learned was Garrett, would come to taunt us or drop cryptic hints about their plans. "Your parents must be frantic by now," he said during one such visit, leaning against the doorframe with that ever-present smirk. "Imagine how they'd feel if they knew their precious children were so close, yet so far out of reach." "What do you want from us?" I demanded, my fear momentarily overcome by frustration and anger. Garrett's smirk widened. "It's not about what I want from you. It's about what your parents are willing to give up to get you back." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This is about money? You're holding us for ransom? He clapped slowly, mockingly. Give the boy a prize. But it's more than just money. Your parents, they're important people, aren't they? People with influence, with access to things that, let's say, interest me and my associates. I exchanged a horrified glance with Zoe. My father was a senior executive at a major tech company. Her mother was a judge. Whatever these men were after, it was clear they had chosen their victims carefully. They won't give you anything, Zoe said, her voice shaking but defiant. They'll go to the police. Garrett's expression darkened. Oh, they'll give us exactly what we want. Unless they want to see their children returned in pieces. The threat hung in the air, chilling and all too real. As Garrett left, locking the door behind him, Zoe and I were left to grapple with the terrible truth of our situation. We weren't just being held for money. We were pawns in a larger game, one that could have consequences far beyond our own lives. We have to get out of here, I said, my mind racing, before they force our parents to do whatever it is they want. Zoe nodded, her earlier hopelessness replaced by grim determination. But how? We're locked in, and even if we could get out of this room, we don't know the layout of the cabin or where we are in the forest. I stood, beginning to pace the small space. We need to gather information, pay attention to their routines, look for any weaknesses we can exploit. And so began our careful observation. We listened at the door, trying to catch snippets of conversation. We examined every inch of our small prison, looking for any potential way out. We even started to fake illness, hoping to be moved to a different part of the cabin, where we might have a better chance of escape. Days passed, each one bringing us closer to whatever deadline our captors had set. The pressure was mounting, and we knew our window of opportunity was shrinking. Then, on what we estimated to be our 5th day of captivity, a chance presented itself. One of the men, not Garrett, but a younger, more nervous-looking one, came to bring us food. As he set the tray down, I noticed his hand shaking slightly. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral, non-threatening. He startled, looking at me with wide eyes. "I'm fine," he snapped, but there was an uncertainty in his tone. "You don't have to do this, you know," Zoe said softly. "Whatever Garrett's planning, it's not too late to stop it." The man's eyes darted between us, then to the door. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's no stopping it now. It's already in motion." Before we could press him further, he hurried out of the room. But in his haste, he did something that sent a surge of hope through me. He forgot to lock the door. As soon as his footsteps faded, I rushed to the door, pressing my ear against it to listen for any signs of movement outside. When I heard nothing, I slowly, carefully turned the handle. The door opened with a soft creak. Zoe and I exchanged a look of mingled fear and excitement. This was our chance, perhaps our only chance, at escape. "What do we do?" Zoe whispered. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "We run, as fast and as far as we can." With hearts pounding and adrenaline coursing through our veins, we stepped out of our prison and into the unknown. Our escape had begun, but the true test of our survival still lay ahead. The hallway outside our room was mercifully empty. The flickering light of an old television set spilled from the main room of the cabin, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. Our captors were distracted, for now. I motioned for Zoe to follow me, pressing a finger to my lips. We crept down the hallway, every creak of the old floorboards setting my nerves on edge. As we neared the end of the corridor, I peered around the corner, trying to assess our best route of escape. The main room was dimly lit, the TV casting eerie shadows on the walls. Two of the men, not including Garrett or the nervous younger one, were slouched on the sagging couch, their attention fixed on some sports game playing on the screen. Empty beer bottles littered the floor around them. The front door was visible from where we stood, tantalizingly close. But to reach it, we'd have to cross the open space of the main room. It was a risk, but one we had to take. I caught Zoe's eye and pointed towards the door, miming a running motion. She nodded, her face pale but determined. Taking a deep breath, I held up 3 fingers, counting down silently. 3, 2, 1. We burst from our hiding spot, sprinting across the room as fast as our legs could carry us. The men on the couch shouted in surprise, fumbling to get up. But their reflexes were slowed by alcohol and complacency, giving us the precious seconds we needed. I reached the door first, my hand closing around the knob. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it might be locked. But it turned, the door swinging open with a rush of cool night air. We didn't pause to savor our first breath of freedom. Instead, we ran headlong into the darkness, the shouts of our captors spurring us on. The forest was a maze of shadows and looming trees. Branches whipped at our faces and arms as we crashed through the underbrush, driven by pure adrenaline and the desperate need to put as much distance between us and the cabin as possible. Behind us, I could hear the men crashing through the woods in pursuit. They had the advantage of knowing the terrain, but we had the advantage of fear-fueled speed and the cover of darkness. "This way," Zoe gasped, tugging my arm to the left. I followed blindly, trusting her instincts. We scrambled up a steep incline, loose rocks and dirt sliding beneath our feet. At the top, we paused for a moment, gulping in air and straining our ears for any sound of pursuit. The forest was eerily quiet. Too quiet. "Do you think we lost them?" Zoe whispered, her voice barely audible over our ragged breathing. I shook my head, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. "I don't know, but we can't stop now. We need to keep moving." We pressed on, our pace slowing as exhaustion began to set in. The adrenaline that had fueled our initial escape was fading, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and the constant gnawing fear of recapture. As we stumbled through the darkness, I tried to orient myself. But without any clear landmarks or even a view of the stars through the dense canopy, it was impossible to know which direction we were heading. For all we knew, we could be running in circles or even back towards the cabin. After what felt like hours of aimless wandering, we came across a small stream. The sound of running water was a welcome break from the oppressive silence of the forest. "We should follow it," Zoe suggested, her voice hoarse from thirst and exertion. "Downstream. It might lead us to a road or a town." It was as good a plan as any. We began to make our way along the stream bank, the terrain slightly easier to navigate than the dense underbrush we'd been fighting through. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, we allowed ourselves a moment of hope. We'd made it through the night. Perhaps we'd actually managed to escape. That hope was shattered by the distant but unmistakable sound of barking. "Dogs," I breathed, my heart sinking. "They're using dogs to track us." Zoe's face paled in the growing light. "What do we do?" I looked around frantically, searching for some way to throw off the scent. My eyes landed on the stream. The water. It might mask our scent. We need to walk in the stream for as long as we can. Without waiting for a response, I stepped into the cold water. Zoe followed, wincing at the shock of it. We began to move downstream as quickly as we could, fighting against the current and the slippery rocks beneath our feet. The sound of barking grew louder, spurring us to move faster despite our exhaustion. We rounded a bend in the stream and suddenly found ourselves facing a steep drop-off. The stream plunged over the edge in a small waterfall, maybe 15 feet high. "We have to jump," Zoe said, her voice tight with fear but resolute. I nodded, knowing we had no other choice. The dogs were getting closer by the second. We backed up a few steps, then ran forward and leapt off the edge together. For a moment, we were suspended in the air, and then we plummeted into the pool below. The impact drove the breath from my lungs. The cold water closed over my head, disorienting me. For a terrifying moment, I couldn't tell which way was up. Then my survival instincts kicked in, and I kicked hard, breaking the surface with a gasp. Zoe surfaced beside me, coughing and sputtering. We swam to the edge of the pool, dragging ourselves onto the rocky shore. "You okay?" I asked, checking her for any signs of injury. She nodded, pushing her wet hair out of her face. "Yeah. You?" "I think so." I glanced back up at the top of the waterfall. There was no sign of our pursuers yet, but the barking was still audible, if more distant now. "We need to keep moving," I said, struggling to my feet. As we set off again, following the stream's new course, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. We had escaped the immediate threat, but we were still lost in a vast wilderness, with dangerous men hunting us down. Our only hope was to find civilization before our strength gave out, or our luck ran out. As the sun slowly rose, painting the forest in shades of gold and green, we pressed on, each step taking us further into the unknown. The day wore on, the sun climbing high in the sky and then beginning its slow descent. We had long since left the stream behind, striking out in what we hoped was the direction of civilization. But the forest seemed endless, each tree indistinguishable from the last. Our clothes, still damp from our plunge over the waterfall, clung uncomfortably to our skin. Hunger gnawed at our stomachs, and thirst made our throats burn. But we didn't dare stop to rest or search for food or water, the memory of barking dogs driving us onward. As the light began to fade once more, panic started to set in. We couldn't survive another night in the forest, not in our weakened state. "Look!" Zoe suddenly exclaimed, pointing ahead. At first I couldn't see what had caught her attention. Then I saw it. A thin column of smoke rising above the treetops in the distance. "It could be a campfire," I said, hope surging through me. "Or a cabin. Maybe someone who can help us." We quickened our pace, pushing through our exhaustion. As we drew nearer, we could make out the faint glow of firelight through the trees, but as we approached, something felt off. The fire was too big for a campfire, and there was an acrid smell in the air that made my stomach churn. We crept closer, staying low and moving as quietly as we could. When we finally got a clear view of the source of the smoke, my heart sank. It was the cabin, our prison, and it was engulfed in flames. Garrett and his men stood in the clearing, watching the inferno. Even from our hidden vantage point, I could see the tension in their postures, the anger in their voices as they argued among themselves. "They're destroying the evidence," Zoe whispered, her voice trembling. "If they find us now." I nodded grimly, understanding the implication. With the cabin gone, there would be no proof of what they'd done to us. If they caught us now, they'd have no reason to keep us alive. As we watched, frozen with indecision, a new sound cut through the crackling of the flames. Sirens, growing louder by the second. The men in the clearing heard it too. They scattered, disappearing into the woods in different directions. "We have to go," I said, tugging on Zoe's arm. "The police will be here soon. We can get help." But as we turned to make our way towards the approaching sirens, a twig snapped behind us. We spun around to find ourselves face to face with Garrett. His eyes were wild, his face streaked with soot and sweat. In his hand, he clutched a hunting knife, its blade glinting in the firelight. "Well, well," he snarled, his earlier composure completely gone. "Looks like our little rats found their way back to the trap." We backed away slowly, but Garrett matched us step for step. The sirens were louder now, but still too far away. "You've ruined everything," Garrett spat. "Months of planning, all gone because you couldn't just sit quietly and wait." He lunged forward suddenly, the knife slashing through the air. I stumbled backwards, feeling the sting as the blade grazed my arm. Zoe screamed, grabbing a fallen branch and swinging it at Garrett's head. He ducked, the makeshift weapon whistling past his ear. I seized the moment of distraction to tackle him, driving us both to the ground. The knife flew from his hand, landing somewhere in the underbrush. We grappled in the dirt, each fighting for dominance. Garrett was stronger, fueled by desperation and rage. He managed to flip me onto my back, his hands closing around my throat. As black spots began to dance at the edges of my vision, I heard a dull thud. Garrett's grip loosened, and he slumped to the side, unconscious. Zoe stood over us, the branch clutched in her trembling hands. I hit him, she said, her voice small and shocked. Before I could respond, flashlight beams cut through the darkness. Voices called out, growing closer. "Here!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "We're over here! Help us!" Moments later, the clearing was flooded with light as police officers and rescue workers swarmed in. Everything became a blur of questions and emergency blankets and the flashing lights of ambulances. As we were led away from the smoldering remains of the cabin, I caught one last glimpse of Garrett being handcuffed and loaded into a police car. Our nightmare was finally over. The days and weeks that followed our rescue were a whirlwind of hospital visits, police interviews, and tearful reunions with our families. The full scope of Garrett's plan came to light during the investigation, a complex scheme involving not just ransom, but corporate espionage and blackmail on a massive scale. Zoe and I were hailed as heroes in the media, our escape and survival painted as a triumph of the human spirit. But the reality was far less glamorous. We both struggled with nightmares, with sudden panic attacks triggered by the smallest things. The creak of a floorboard, the smell of pine needles, the sound of a dog barking in the distance. Therapy helped, as did the unwavering support of our families and each other. Slowly, we began to heal, to reclaim the pieces of ourselves that had been left behind in that forest. 1 year to the day after our rescue, Zoe and I met at a small cafe in town. It was the first time we'd seen each other in months, both of us having needed space to process everything on our own. "You look good," I said, as she slid into the booth across from me. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "So do you. How have you been?" We talked for hours, catching up on everything we'd missed in each other's lives. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cafe table, Zoe's expression grew serious. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked quietly. "To the forest, I mean." I considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Not because I want to relive it, but I don't know. To prove to myself that it's just a place, that it doesn't have power over us anymore." Zoe nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Maybe we could go together someday. Not now, but when we're ready." As we left the cafe, stepping out into the warm evening air, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The ordeal we had endured would always be a part of us, a dark chapter in our lives. But it didn't define us. We had survived, we had escaped, and now we were reclaiming our lives one day at a time. The future stretched out before us, full of possibilities and challenges yet to come. But whatever lay ahead, I knew we would face it with the same strength and determination that had seen us through our darkest hours. As we said our goodbyes, promising to stay in touch, I looked up at the stars twinkling in the darkening sky. The same stars that had shone down on us during those terrifying nights in the forest now seemed to wink with hope and promise. We had made it through the long night. And now, finally, a new day was dawning. The crisp autumn air nipped at my face as I hiked deeper into the dense forest, my heavy backpack digging into my shoulders. It was October 15th, 2022, and at 32 years old, I had decided it was high time for a solo camping trip to clear my head and reconnect with nature. The stresses of my job as a software engineer in the bustling city had been wearing me down, and I craved the solitude and peace that only the wilderness could provide. As I trudged along the winding trail, the fallen leaves crunched beneath my boots, creating a rhythmic sound that seemed to echo through the trees. The forest was alive with the vibrant colors of fall, deep reds, bright oranges, and golden yellows painting the landscape in a breathtaking display. Despite the beauty surrounding me, an inexplicable unease began to creep into my mind. The further I ventured from the main trail, the denser the forest became. Shadows lengthened as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting an eerie gloom over the woods. The trees seemed to grow taller, their gnarled branches reaching out like crooked fingers. I shook off the feeling, attributing it to my overactive imagination and years of watching too many horror movies. After hours of hiking, I finally stumbled upon what appeared to be the perfect camping spot. A small, calm pond glimmered in the fading sunlight, surrounded by a clearing that would provide ample space for my tent. The area was secluded, far off the main trail, exactly what I had been looking for. I set my backpack down with a grunt of relief and began to survey the area. The pond's surface was like glass, reflecting the sky and trees in perfect detail. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, creating a soothing whisper that seemed to welcome me to this hidden oasis. As I began to set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes I found myself glancing over my shoulder, peering into the depths of the forest. But each time, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. I tried to rationalize my unease, reminding myself that it was natural to feel a bit on edge when alone in an unfamiliar environment. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the pond to hear the gentle lapping of water against the shore. As I hammered the last stake into the ground, a twig snapped somewhere in the forest behind me. I whirled around, my heart rate spiking, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just trees swaying gently in the breeze and lengthening shadows as the sun continued its descent. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, running a hand through my hair. "It's probably just a deer or something." But even as I tried to reassure myself, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The forest seemed too quiet, too still. Where were the chirping birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush? The sounds I had expected to hear in a thriving woodland were conspicuously absent. As darkness began to fall, I gathered firewood and created a small fire pit. The act of building the fire helped calm my nerves, giving me something tangible to focus on. Soon, flames danced merrily, pushing back the encroaching darkness and providing a comforting warmth. I sat by the fire, roasting a hot dog over the flames and trying to relax. The stars began to emerge overhead, twinkling brightly against the deepening blue of the sky. It was a beautiful sight, one that I had sorely missed living in the light-polluted city. Yet, even as I admired the view, I couldn't fully shake the sense of unease that had taken root in my mind. As I finished my simple meal, a cool breeze swept through the clearing, causing the flames to flicker and dance. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a tree. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart raced as I scanned the tree line, squinting to see through the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But the feeling of being watched intensified, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, that the strange shadows were simply a result of the firelight dancing on the trees. But deep down, a primal part of me knew better. Something was out there in the darkness, watching and waiting. As I crawled into my tent that night, zipping the entrance closed behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake coming out here alone. Sleep was long in coming, and when it finally did, it was filled with dark, unsettling dreams of being chased through an endless forest by something I could never quite see. I jolted awake in the middle of the night, my heart pounding and sweat beading on my forehead. The air inside the tent was frigid, and an unnatural silence pressed in from all sides. Gone were the gentle sounds of the forest that had lulled me to sleep. The soft hooting of owls, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant calls of nocturnal animals. In their place was a silence so complete it seemed to have a weight of its own. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I strained my ears, listening for any sound that might explain the sudden change. But there was nothing. Just an oppressive, all-encompassing silence that seemed to swallow even the sound of my own rapid heartbeat. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something else was wrong. The comforting glow of my campfire, which I had carefully banked before going to bed, was visible through the thin fabric of my tent. But I had extinguished that fire, hadn't I? I distinctly remembered pouring water over the embers, watching them hiss and sputter into darkness. With trembling hands, I reached for the zipper of my tent, my mind racing with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had someone, or something, relit my fire? And if so, why? What could be out there, waiting in the darkness? I hesitated, my hand on the zipper, fear freezing me in place. Part of me wanted to stay in the illusory safety of my tent, to close my eyes and pray that this was all just a vivid nightmare. But I knew I had to look. I had to know what was happening. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The sight that greeted me sent a jolt of terror through my body. The campfire was indeed burning again, flames flickering and casting long, shifting shadows across the clearing. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. My campsite had been rearranged. My backpack, which I had left leaning against a nearby tree, was now sitting upright next to the fire. My boots, which I distinctly remembered leaving by the tent entrance, were neatly placed side by side several feet away. Even the small pot I had used to boil water was in a different spot, hanging from a branch as if someone had carefully placed it there. I blinked hard, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, everything was still wrong, still moved, still rearranged by unseen hands. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the area around my camp, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands. The darkness between them was absolute, impenetrable, hiding who knew what horrors. As my gaze swept across the pond, I saw something that made my heart nearly stop. There, at the water's edge, barely visible in the flickering firelight, was a set of footprints. They led from the forest to the water and then back again, disappearing into the tree line. But these were no animal tracks. These were clearly human, or at least humanoid, footprints, large and deeply impressed in the soft mud of the shore. I stared at the tracks, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. Someone, or something, had been here while I slept, had walked around my camp, moved my things, relit my fire, had stood at the edge of the pond, perhaps watching me as I slumbered, unaware of the danger lurking just outside my tent. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the fire's light, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. My eyes snapped to the source of the sound, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement. A tall, dark shape slipping behind a tree, gone so quickly I couldn't be sure if it was real or just a trick of the shadows. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I wanted to run, to flee into the night and not stop until I reached civilization. But terror rooted me to the spot, my body refusing to move as my mind screamed at me to escape. As I sat there, frozen in fear, I became aware of a sound, so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it, but growing steadily louder. It was a whisper, carried on the chill night air. Words I couldn't quite make out, spoken in a voice that was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding me, pressing in on me from all sides. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder. The whispers seemed to be inside my head now, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once in languages I didn't understand. My vision began to swim, the world around me blurring and distorting as if I was looking through warped glass. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when I was sure I would lose my mind to the terrifying whispers and the oppressive presence I could feel watching me from the darkness, everything stopped. The whispers cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence so profound it was almost painful. I sat there, shaking, for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Slowly, cautiously, I lowered my hands from my ears. The night was quiet once more, but not with the unnatural silence from before. I could hear the gentle lapping of water at the pond's edge, the soft rustle of leaves in a light breeze. Normal, natural sounds that should have been comforting, but now only served to heighten my sense of unease. What had just happened? Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind out here in the wilderness, alone and far from help? Or was there really something out there? Something that had visited my camp in the night and was now watching me from the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity? As the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion washed over me. But I knew I wouldn't be sleeping again that night. I couldn't. Not with the knowledge, or at least the fear, that I wasn't alone out here. That something was stalking me, toying with me, for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my tent, my back pressed against my backpack, a small knife clutched in my trembling hands. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow seen through the tent fabric made my heart race. I had never felt so vulnerable, so utterly alone and defenseless. As I sat there, waiting for dawn with a desperation I had never known before, one thought kept running through my mind. I had to get out of these woods. As soon as there was enough light to see, I would pack up and hike out as fast as I could. Whatever was out there, whatever had visited my camp in the night, I wanted no part of it. But a small, terrified voice in the back of my mind whispered a chilling thought. What if it doesn't want to let me leave? The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across my campsite. I hadn't slept a wink since the terrifying events of the night, my body tense and alert, jumping at every small sound. As soon as it was light enough to see, I unzipped my tent with shaking hands and peered out. The clearing looked peaceful in the early morning light. No sign of the eerie disturbances from the night before. My belongings were back where I had originally placed them, and the fire pit contained only cold, wet ashes. If it weren't for the lingering fear that clenched my gut, and the vivid memories seared into my mind, I might have been able to convince myself it had all been a nightmare. But I knew better. The footprints by the pond were still there, stark evidence that something had indeed visited my camp in the night. I shuddered as I looked at them, remembering the whispers and the feeling of being watched. I wasted no time in breaking camp. My hands trembled as I packed up my gear, my eyes constantly darting to the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less threatening perhaps, but no less unsettling. The trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining to create a canopy that blocked out much of the sky. Shadows shifted and danced as a light breeze rustled through the leaves, and more than once I spun around, certain I had seen something moving just at the edge of my vision. As I worked, I became aware of a sound, or rather, a lack of sound. The forest was eerily quiet. No birdsong greeted the morning, no squirrels chattered in the trees. Even the insects seemed to have fallen silent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I shouldered my backpack, wincing at its weight, and took one last look around the clearing. My eyes were drawn to the pond, its surface like a mirror in the still morning air. For a moment, I thought I saw something reflected in its depths. a tall, dark shape standing among the trees on the far shore. I blinked, and it was gone. Heart pounding, I turned and began to walk quickly down the trail that led back to civilization. Every step I took felt like it was being watched, evaluated. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, always just out of sight. The trail seemed different from when I had hiked in. The trees pressed closer, their branches reaching out as if trying to snag my clothing. Roots seemed to appear out of nowhere, threatening to trip me with every step. More than once I stumbled, my heart leaping into my throat as I imagined unseen hands reaching out to grab me. As I walked, the silence of the forest was broken by occasional sounds that sent chills down my spine. A twig snapping behind me, a rustling in the underbrush to my left. Once I could have sworn I heard footsteps matching my own, stopping when I stopped, resuming when I did. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows and the oppressive silence that seemed to swallow up every sound. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the forest. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I realized I didn't recognize my surroundings. Had I taken a wrong turn somewhere? The path I was on didn't look familiar, and the trees seemed to grow denser with every step I took. Panic began to set in as I realized I might be lost. I stopped, trying to get my bearings, but every direction looked the same. Endless trees stretching as far as the eye could see. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use its GPS, only to find that there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I was miles from the nearest cell tower, alone in a forest that seemed to be actively working against me. A sound behind me made me whirl around, my heart pounding. There, just for a moment, I saw it. A tall, dark figure standing between two trees. It was unnaturally thin and seemed to blend into the shadows, its edges indistinct and wavering. But its eyes, God, its eyes, they glowed with an inner light, fixed directly on me. I blinked, and it was gone. But the image was seared into my mind, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was not alone in these woods. Something was out there, something that defied explanation, and it was hunting me. Terror gave me new strength, and I began to run. I no longer cared about following the trail or finding my way back. My only thought was to get away, to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms, roots threatening to trip me with every step. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but fear drove me onward. Behind me, I could hear something moving through the forest. It made no sound, but I could feel its presence, closing in with every passing second. As I ran, the forest seemed to come alive around me. Shadows deepened and shifted, reaching out with dark tendrils as if trying to ensnare me. The trees themselves seemed to move, their branches bending and swaying in ways that had nothing to do with the wind. More than once, I had to dodge as a low-hanging limb suddenly swung down in front of me, threatening to clothesline me if I didn't react in time. The ground beneath my feet began to change, becoming soft and spongy. I looked down and realized with horror that I was running through a boggy area. Each step sank inches into the muck, making it harder and harder to move. Panic clawed at my throat as I imagined myself sinking into the mud, unable to escape as whatever was chasing me closed in. I pushed forward, my legs burning with the effort of pulling my feet free from the sucking mud with each step. The air grew thick and heavy, filled with a foul, rotting stench that made my eyes water and my stomach churn. Mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around my legs and obscuring my vision. Through the mist, I caught glimpses of things that shouldn't be there. Dark shapes moving just at the edge of my vision. Twisted, gnarled trees that seemed to reach out with branch-like fingers. And always, the feeling of being watched, hunted, pursued by something I couldn't see but knew was there. My foot caught on something hidden beneath the surface of the bog, and I went down hard, face first into the foul-smelling muck. I spluttered and gasped, spitting out mud and who knows what else, terror giving me the strength to push myself back to my feet. As I stood, trying to wipe the mud from my eyes, I saw it again. The tall, dark figure, standing motionless at the edge of the bog. It was closer now, close enough that I could make out more details, though my mind recoiled from what I was seeing. Its body was impossibly thin and elongated, its limbs too long and jointed in all the wrong places. Its face, if you could call it that, was a blank, featureless expanse, save for those glowing eyes that bored into me with an intensity that froze me in place. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think. Then, slowly, deliberately, it took a step towards me. The spell broke, and I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I crashed through the forest, my only thought to get away, to escape the nightmare that was pursuing me. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but still I pushed on, driven by a primal fear that overrode all else. Finally, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I burst out of the tree line. Sunlight, bright and warm, hit my face, momentarily blinding me after the gloom of the forest. I stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I was standing on the edge of a road. A normal paved road that meant civilization, safety, escape from the horrors of the forest. Cars whooshed by, their drivers oblivious to the nightmare I had just lived through. I turned, looking back at the forest I had just emerged from. It stood there, dark and silent, revealing nothing of the terrors that lurked within its depths. For a moment, I thought I saw a tall, thin shape standing just inside the tree line, watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone. I flagged down the next car that came along, probably looking like a madman with my mud-caked clothes and wild eyes. The kind elderly couple who stopped were clearly concerned, asking if I needed medical attention. I babbled something about getting lost while hiking, thanking them profusely as they offered me a ride to the nearest town. As we drove away, I couldn't stop myself from looking back at the forest receding in the distance. It looked so normal, so innocuous from here. But I knew the truth. I knew what was hiding in those woods, waiting, watching. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that it wasn't done with me yet. I never went camping again after that. I moved out of the area as soon as I could, trying to put as much distance between myself and those woods as possible. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up in a cold sweat, certain that I can hear whispers in the darkness. And in my dreams, I'm running through an endless forest, pursued by a tall, dark figure with glowing eyes, always just one step behind me. The weeks following my terrifying experience in the forest were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoia-filled days. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in the safety of my own home. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every unexpected sound made me jump. I tried to rationalize what had happened, to convince myself that it had all been a product of my imagination, fueled by exhaustion and the isolation of the wilderness. But deep down, I knew the truth. The memory of those glowing eyes, that impossibly tall and thin figure, was too vivid, too real to be dismissed as mere fantasy. I threw myself into my work, hoping that the familiar routine and mental challenges of software engineering would help push the memories to the back of my mind. But even as I stared at lines of code on my computer screen, I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that dark figure looming behind me. My colleagues noticed the change in me, the dark circles under my eyes, my jumpiness, the way I would sometimes trail off mid-sentence, my gaze fixed on something only I could see. They asked if I was okay, if something had happened. I brushed off their concerns with vague explanations about a bad camping trip and too much caffeine. How could I possibly explain what I had experienced? They would think I was crazy. As the days turned into weeks, the acute fear began to fade, replaced by a constant, low-level anxiety that hummed in the background of my life. I started seeing a therapist, hoping that talking about my experience might help. But even as I recounted my story, I found myself holding back, unable to fully articulate the horror of what I had seen and felt in those woods. The therapist listened patiently, nodding and making notes. She suggested that perhaps the stress of my job and the isolation of the camping trip had triggered some sort of panic attack or hallucination. It was a rational explanation, one that part of me desperately wanted to believe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, that what I had encountered in the forest was something beyond the realm of conventional psychology. One night, about a month after my camping trip, I woke suddenly, my heart pounding. The room was dark, but I had the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the corner of my bedroom, was a tall, dark shape. It stood motionless, its outline blurring and shifting as if it wasn't quite solid. And those eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, were fixed directly on me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own bed as the figure slowly, deliberately began to move towards me. Just as it reached the foot of my bed, I jerked awake with a gasp. The room was empty. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and I could hear the normal sounds of the city waking up outside. It had been a dream. Just a dream. But as I sat there, my sheets soaked with sweat, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been more than that. That somehow, whatever I had encountered in the forest had followed me home. That was the day I decided I couldn't stay in the city anymore. I needed to get away, to find somewhere I felt safe. Within a week, I had quit my job and packed up my belongings. I moved to a small town on the coast, as far from any large forests as I could get. The sound of the ocean and the wide-open views of the horizon helped ease my fears, at least during the day. But at night, when the shadows lengthened and the world grew quiet, I still found myself checking and rechecking the locks on my doors and windows. I still woke up in a cold sweat, certain that I had heard whispers in the darkness or seen a tall, thin shape moving just at the edge of my vision. I know now that I'll never truly escape what happened in those woods. Whatever I encountered there, whatever hunted me through the trees and mist, it left its mark on me. Not just in the nightmares and the constant nagging fear, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. It showed me that there are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that lurk in the shadows and prey on the unwary. Sometimes, when I'm walking along the beach at twilight, I find myself looking back at the line of trees that marks the border between the town and the inland forests. And for just a moment, I think I see something moving among the shadows. Something tall and thin, with eyes that glow in the gathering darkness. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that it's still out there. Waiting, watching, and one day, it will come for me again. As the months passed in my new coastal home, the immediate terror of my experience in the forest began to fade, replaced by a gnawing curiosity. The need to understand what had happened to me, to make sense of the inexplicable, grew stronger with each passing day. I found myself spending more and more time online, searching for any information that might shed light on what I had encountered. At first, my searches yielded little more than campfire stories and urban legends. Tales of mysterious creatures in the woods, of hikers gone missing, of strange lights and unexplained sounds. None of it seemed to quite match what I had experienced, but each story added to the growing certainty that I wasn't alone in my encounter with the unexplained. I began to reach out to others who claimed to have had similar experiences. Most were reluctant to talk at first, fearing ridicule or disbelief. But as I shared my own story, they opened up. Their accounts varied in detail, but there were common threads that sent chills down my spine. The feeling of being watched, the unnatural silence of the forest, and most chillingly, descriptions of a tall, thin figure with glowing eyes. One night, as I was deep into another research session, I came across a forum dedicated to folklore and paranormal experiences. A thread caught my eye: the Watchers in the Woods. As I read through the posts, my heart began to race. The descriptions were eerily familiar. People from all over the world recounting encounters with tall, shadowy figures in forests and wooded areas. Beings that seemed to straddle the line between physical and ethereal, that defied the laws of nature as we understood them. One post in particular stood out. It was from a user claiming to be a folklorist specializing in forest mythologies. They wrote about an ancient belief found in cultures across the globe of entities that guarded the wild places of the world. These beings were said to be as old as the forests themselves, neither fully spirit nor fully flesh, existing in the liminal spaces between our world and something else. The folklorist's post went on to discuss various names for these entities: the Waldgeist of German folklore, the Leshy of Slavic mythology, the Wendigo of Algonquian legend. While the details varied from culture to culture, the core concept remained the same. Powerful, otherworldly beings that protected the wilderness and punished those who disrespected or intruded upon their domain. As I read, a chill ran down my spine. Could this be what I had encountered? Some ancient guardian of the forest, disturbed by my presence? It seemed fantastical, impossible to reconcile with my understanding of the world. And yet, the memory of those glowing eyes, that impossible figure, was burned into my mind. If such things could exist, then perhaps the legends held more truth than I had ever imagined. I reached out to the folklorist, desperate for more information. To my surprise, they responded, expressing interest in my experience. We began a correspondence, exchanging emails filled with legends, theories, and personal accounts. The folklorist, while careful not to confirm or deny the reality of such beings, provided me with a wealth of information that both fascinated and terrified me. One particular piece of lore stuck with me. According to some traditions, once a person had encountered one of these forest guardians, they were marked. The entity would be aware of them forever after, able to sense their presence to find them no matter where they went. The thought sent a shiver through me. Was this why I still felt watched, even so far from the forest where it all began? As my research deepened, I began to notice things. Small things at first. A book on local legends appearing on my recommended list when I hadn't searched for anything related. A documentary about unexplained phenomena in forests playing on TV just as I turned it on. Coincidences, I told myself, but they began to pile up. Then came the dreams. Vivid, terrifying dreams of running through endless forests, pursued by a tall, dark figure. I would wake gasping for breath, sheets tangled around me, the memory of glowing eyes fading as consciousness returned. But even awake, I couldn't shake the feeling that the dreams were more than just dreams. That somehow, on some level, the entity was reaching out to me. One night, unable to sleep, I went for a walk along the beach. The moon was full, casting a silvery light over the waves. As I walked, lost in thought, I found myself approaching the line of trees that marked the edge of the forest that bordered the town. I stopped, my heart beginning to race as I stared into the shadows between the trunks. For a moment, everything was still. Then, just at the edge of my vision, I saw movement. A tall, thin shape, moving with unnatural grace between the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. But I knew what I had seen. It had found me. or perhaps it had never lost me. I turned and ran back to my house, locking the door behind me and drawing all the curtains. As I sat in the darkness, trying to calm my racing heart, I realized something. My research, my obsession with understanding what had happened to me, had drawn its attention. In seeking answers, I had inadvertently called out to it, letting it know exactly where I was. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I had to stop. Stop the research. Stop reaching out to others with similar experiences. Stop trying to understand something that was perhaps beyond human comprehension. If I was indeed marked, as the legend suggested, then my only hope was to try to fade into obscurity, to become unremarkable and uninteresting to whatever was out there watching me. But even as I closed my laptop and packed away my notes, I knew it was probably too late. The entity, whatever it was aware of me now. And somewhere out there, in the depths of the forests that still covered so much of our world, it was waiting, watching. And one day, when I least expected it, we would meet again. Months passed, and I did my best to put my experience and subsequent research behind me. I found a new job, working remotely as a software developer for a small startup. I made friends in my coastal town, joined a local gym, tried to build a normal life. But always, in the back of my mind, was the knowledge that something was out there, watching, waiting. I avoided the forests that bordered the town, sticking to the beach and the open areas where I felt safer, more exposed. But I couldn't escape the trees entirely. They were always there, a dark line on the horizon, a reminder of what lurked in their shadows. As summer turned to fall, I began to have dreams again. Not the terrifying nightmares of being chased through endless woods, but something more subtle, more insidious. In these dreams, I would find myself standing at the edge of a forest, looking in. And from the darkness between the trees, I would hear a voice, soft, barely audible, calling my name, calling me home. I would wake from these dreams feeling unsettled, a strange longing mixed with fear twisting in my gut. Part of me wanted to heed that call, to step into the woods and finally confront whatever was waiting for me there. But the rational part of my mind, the part that still clung to the normal, everyday world, held me back. Then came the day when everything changed. I was out for my usual morning run along the beach when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There, washed up on the sand, was a branch. But not just any branch. This one was twisted and gnarled in a way that seemed familiar, that sent a chill down my spine. As I approached it, my heart pounding, I realized why it looked so familiar. It was identical to the branches I had seen in the forest during my camping trip, the ones that had seemed to reach out and try to grab me as I fled. But that forest was hundreds of miles away. How could this be here? I reached out to touch the branch, half expecting it to come to life and wrap around my wrist. But it remained inert, just a piece of driftwood on the beach. As I examined it more closely, I noticed something carved into its surface. A symbol, crude but unmistakable. An eye. My blood ran cold as I stared at that carved eye. This was no coincidence, no random piece of driftwood. This was a message. It had found me. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, unable to focus on work, jumping at every sound. As night fell, I found myself drawn to the window, staring out at the line of trees in the distance. And as I watched, I saw something that made my heart stop. A figure, tall and thin, standing just at the edge of the forest. Even from this distance, I could see its eyes glowing in the darkness. It raised one impossibly long arm, beckoning to me, calling me. In that moment, I knew I had a choice to make. I could stay here, continue to hide, continue to live in fear. Or I could face whatever this thing was, confront it once and for all. My heart pounding, I made my decision. I grabbed a flashlight and my phone, though I doubted either would be much help against what I was about to face. With shaking hands, I opened my front door and stepped out into the night. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of salt and seaweed from the nearby ocean. But as I approached the tree line, that familiar scent gave way to something else, the earthy, organic smell of the forest. It was as if the woods were extending their influence, reaching out to envelop me even before I stepped beneath the canopy. As I drew closer to the trees, I could see the figure more clearly. It stood motionless, those glowing eyes fixed on me, still beckoning with one elongated arm. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but I forced myself to keep moving forward. I had to know. I had to understand. I paused at the edge of the forest, my flashlight beam seeming weak and ineffective against the dense shadows. The figure had disappeared, but I could feel its presence, drawing me in. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the woods. The change was immediate and disorienting. The sounds of the town and the distant ocean faded away, replaced by an unnatural silence. The air grew thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. My flashlight flickered, its beam growing dimmer with each step I took. I pushed deeper into the forest, branches seeming to reach out and grab at my clothes, roots rising up to trip my feet. The trees pressed in close, their trunks twisted and gnarled in ways that defied nature. And always, the feeling of being watched, of being herded towards some unknown destination. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I stumbled through the darkness. It could have been minutes or hours that I wandered, my sense of direction completely lost. Just as I was about to give up, to turn back and try to find my way out of this nightmare, I emerged into a small clearing. There, in the center of the clearing, stood the figure. Seeing it up close, I realized that all my nightmares and memories had failed to capture its true horror. It was tall, far taller than any human, its body impossibly thin and jointed in ways that made no anatomical sense. Its skin, if you could call it that, seemed to shift and ripple, sometimes appearing bark-like, sometimes smooth as shadows. But it was the face that truly terrified me. Or rather, the lack of a face. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, blank expanse, broken only by those glowing eyes. Eyes that now bored into me with an intensity that froze me in place. For a long moment we stood there, facing each other in the clearing. Then, slowly, deliberately, it began to move towards me. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot as surely as the trees around me. As it reached out one long, spindly arm towards me, I suddenly realized something. The terror that had gripped me for so long was fading, replaced by a strange sense of calm, of belonging. I understood now why it had called me back, why it had haunted my dreams and my waking hours. I was part of this now. Part of the forest, part of the ancient, unknowable force that this being represented. As its hand touched my forehead, I felt a surge of knowledge, of understanding that went beyond words or human comprehension. In that moment, I saw the truth of the forests, of the wild places of the world. I saw the ancient pact between humanity and nature, the delicate balance that had been disrupted by our modern world. And I understood my role in restoring that balance. As the knowledge flowed into me, I felt myself changing. My body elongating, my senses sharpening, my very essence merging with the forest around me. The last thing I saw with human eyes was the being before me, no longer terrifying, but familiar, welcoming me into a new existence. I don't know how long I stood there, in that clearing, as the transformation took hold. When it was over, I was no longer the person I had been. I was something else, something both more and less than human. A guardian of the forest, a watcher in the woods. Now I stand at the edge of the forests, watching the human world beyond. Sometimes, I see hikers or campers venturing into my domain, and I feel a stirring of the old hunger, the old desire to hunt and terrify. But mostly, I watch and wait, maintaining the ancient balance between the wild and the civilized. And sometimes, on dark nights when the moon is hidden and the wind whispers through the trees, I think back on my human life, on the fear and the curiosity that led me to this place. And I wonder, as I watch the lights of the distant town, if somewhere out there, someone else is feeling that same pull, that same call of the forest. And I wait, patient as the ancient trees around me, for the next guardian to answer the call.